There is a particular stillness that settles over the Mojave Desert once the sun slips below the ridge, a quiet so wide and deep it carries the weight of 200 years of silence. The wasteland surrounding New Vegas holds more than ruins and dust. It carries stories written in desperation, in fractured systems, and in choices made by people who ran out of better options. Among all the lands that survived the bombs, few places are as layered, as morally complex, or as quietly haunting as the Mojave. Fallout New Vegas was a game built on the archaeology of suffering. Tonight, we move gently through the disturbing corners of that desert world, past the casinos and the checkpoints, into the quieter places where history kept its darkest records. Before your eyes grow heavy, maybe tap subscribe for more calming videos, and share where you're watching from tonight. Edward Sala was born in the Boneyard, a stretch of ruined Los Angeles that the new California Republic had slowly been absorbing into its borders. He was educated, raised among followers who believed in knowledge and careful reasoning. He studied pre-war texts with a thoroughness that few wasteland inhabitants could manage, and his mind was genuinely sharp in the way that sometimes made people dangerous. No one who knew him as a young man would have predicted what he would eventually become. And that contrast between the thoughtful scholar and the tyrant is perhaps the most quietly disturbing element of his whole story. When Salo traveled east as part of a missionary expedition from the followers of the apocalypse, he carried books about Roman history, about governance, about the way societies form and fracture under pressure. He read Julius Caesar's accounts with an attention that bordered on obsession, not because he admired the man particularly, but because he saw in those ancient texts a blueprint for something functional. The pre-war world had collapsed because it grew too complex, too fragmented, too burdened by individual freedoms that ultimately pulled civilization apart. Salo believed, with the quiet conviction of a scholar who has never been questioned, that what the wasteland needed was unity achieved through absolute force. He encountered the Blackfoot tribe during that expedition, a group at war with neighboring tribes and slowly losing. Rather than observing from a distance, Salo began to teach them. He instructed them in tactics drawn from his Roman texts, showed them how to organize and coordinate, how to use the psychology of their enemies against them. The transformation was swift and devastating. The Blackfoot absorbed their enemies, and Salo, who had given himself the name Caesar, absorbed the Blackfoot. He did not lead them so much as he replaced everything they had been with something entirely new. What Caesar built afterward was not simply a raiding organization, though it functioned as one in many respects. It was a systematic erasure. Tribes that joined the legion were stripped of their names, their customs, their languages, and their identities. Children were taken and raised not to remember where they came from. Women were assigned roles based on Caesar's reading of Roman custom, roles that had nothing to do with who those women were or what they might have chosen. The legion consumed people and replaced what it found with something more useful, something standardized, something that would endure as long as Caesar's will held. The unsettling core of Caesar's legion is not its brutality, though the brutality is well documented across the Mojave. The unsettling core is how effectively it worked. The roads that fell under legion control became genuinely safe from raider activity. The supply lines functioned. The soldiers did not desert. The system maintained itself through fear and conditioning with a consistency that the NCR, for all its democratic principles, frequently struggled to match. Caesar had essentially proven that under certain conditions, the erasure of human individuality could produce functional outcomes, and that particular proof sits very uneasily in the mind once it has been recognized. At the legate's camp, across the Colorado River on the dam, the Legion's internal hierarchy revealed itself in layers. Officers were educated, trained in Latin, given access to Caesar's collected texts. Common soldiers were kept deliberately uneducated beyond their military function. The distinction was intentional. A soldier who understood too much might begin to question, A soldier who was kept just capable enough to follow orders and enforce them would simply continue. The hierarchy was designed not merely to organize the legion, but to prevent the very conditions under which it might question itself. A design that echoed certain corporate structures of the pre-war world with uncomfortable precision. The legate Lanius was Caesar's most effective instrument, and his story contains its own layer of disturbing detail. He had not always served Caesar willingly. The accounts recovered from legion territories describe a tribal warrior of extraordinary capability who was captured and given a choice: join or face the consequences of refusal. Lanius joined. Over years of service, he became so thoroughly reshaped by the legion's culture that the man he had been before ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. He became exactly what Caesar needed: a weapon of such controlled ferocity that even legion officers who served beside him spoke of his presence in terms usually reserved for natural disasters. What made Linnaeus disturbing was not his capability for violence, which was considerable, but the absence at his center where a person's own desires and fears usually live. The courier could, during the events of the game, engage him in conversation at the final confrontation, and those conversations revealed a military mind so thoroughly organized around Caesar's goals that it had no framework for processing outcomes Caesar had not anticipated. When presented with genuine strategic reason to withdraw, he could be reasoned with, but only barely, and only through the lens of legion doctrine. He had no other lens. Whatever he had been before was simply gone. Caesar himself, by the time the courier arrived at the fort, was dying. A brain tumor had been growing slowly through the years of his greatest victories, undetected and untreated. He knew about it. He had known for some time. A man who had built an empire on the certainty that his vision was correct, on the absolute necessity of his continued presence, was quietly aware that his body was in the process of contradicting everything he claimed to represent. He needed surgery that required the kind of medical equipment that barely survived in the wasteland, and the courier could choose to provide it or withhold it, and either choice carried weight. The tumor is perhaps the most haunting detail of Caesar's whole story. He had stripped the identity from thousands of people, had reshaped entire cultures into instruments of his will, had built something genuinely enduring out of suffering and erasure. And inside his skull, cells were multiplying in ways no philosophy could address. The wasteland has a way of making certain points with a kind of blunt irony that pre-war literature would have considered too obvious. But in Caesar's case, the obvious point lands with unusual force. He had conquered everything except his own biology, and his biology was not interested in his theories. The Mojave region contains several vaults, and collectively they represent some of the most psychologically intricate experiments in the entire vault program. Vault Tech designed each one with a specific variable in mind, a specific question about human behavior it wished to answer, and the Mojave vaults tended toward questions that had no comfortable answers. The researchers who designed them seemed to understand that the most useful data would come from conditions of genuine moral extremity, and they arranged for those conditions with a precision that reads, in hindsight, as something very close to cruelty as a research methodology. Vault 11 stands apart from most other vaults in the program because its experiment did not involve physical privation or the introduction of destabilizing elements from outside. Its experiment was entirely internal. The vault's residents were told, upon sealing, that the computer system governing their life support required an annual human sacrifice. One person had to be offered each year, or the system would execute everyone inside. The choice of who would be sacrificed was left entirely to the population, resolved through a democratic election process. Vault Tech then sat back and observed what a community does when it must vote, every year, on which of its members will die. The results were deeply instructive about human nature in the worst possible way. Social hierarchies formed immediately around the question of vulnerability to selection. Those without influence, without allies, without the kinds of connections that translated into votes in their favor, became targets first. The election process was quickly colonized by the vault's political structures, so that being sacrificed became associated with powerlessness, and being spared became associated with the ability to organize. The ritual of democratic choice became a ritual of social violence, repeated annually until the vault's population had been reduced to a small fraction of its original size. The final revelation waiting at the center of Vault 11's computer system: that the vault's overseer had received a communication long ago explaining that the sacrifice requirement was a test, that refusing to sacrifice anyone would have triggered a positive outcome rather than a negative one, sits at the end of the vault's exploration like a cold weight. All those years, all those votes, all those people who went quietly or not so quietly into whatever the vault's systems arranged for them. The answer had always been to simply refuse, and no one had tried, because the condition of genuine desperation makes refusal nearly impossible to imagine. The people of Vault 11 had not been uniquely weak or uniquely immoral. They had simply been placed in a situation designed to make compliance feel inevitable. The 5 survivors of Vault 11 who finally uncovered the truth and chose to face the Vault's automated defense systems rather than continue the ritual are remembered in the game through a recording. They knew they were likely to die. They went anyway, because continuing had become something they could no longer do. Most of them did die. One walked out, and that single survivor, when confronted by the courier in the wasteland years later, had organized what remained of her emotional life around the fact that she had walked out when the others had not. The experiment was over. The data was gathered. The one who survived carried it forward, not as information, but as a wound. Vault 22, located northeast of Jacobstown, pursued a different kind of question. Its researchers were interested in food security, in the possibility of engineering crops that could survive in a post-nuclear environment. And the vault was designed as an agricultural laboratory, with the full population participating as both researchers and subjects. The plants they developed were extraordinary. They grew faster than anything pre-war agriculture had produced, required minimal water, tolerated radiation levels that should have killed them outright. The vault's researchers achieved something genuinely impressive, a potential solution to one of the most persistent survival problems in the wasteland. The spores that the plants released were not anticipated in the original experimental design. Or if they were anticipated, the documentation does not survive. What the terminals inside Vault 22 record is the gradual transition from a research vault into something else entirely. As the spores worked their way through the ventilation system and began interacting with the vault's inhabitants in ways that the agricultural model had not predicted. The people of Vault 22 did not die quickly. They changed slowly, over months, into something that retained the physical structure of their former selves, while losing the parts that had constituted their individuality. The vault became overgrown with the very plants its inhabitants had cultivated so carefully, and the distinction between the researchers and their subjects eventually dissolved. What the courier finds in Vault 22 is a place that achieved a kind of terrible success. The plants grew. They continue to grow. They will likely continue growing long after the last human connection to the vault's original purpose has been forgotten. The experiment produced results that nobody asked for and nobody wanted, and the system continued anyway. Because systems do not stop when the people who built them are no longer able to redirect them. The plants that killed the residents of Vault 22 still carry seeds. Those seeds travel. Vault 19 sits within the Mojave as one of the more psychologically subtle experiments. Its population was divided into 2 groups, designated by color, red and blue, and housed in separate sections of the vault with equal resources. The division was purely artificial. There was no meaningful difference between the groups beyond the color they had been assigned at entry. Vault Tech wished to observe whether artificial division alone, in the absence of any material inequality, would be sufficient to generate genuine conflict between the groups. The answer the Vault provided was yes, comfortably and depressingly yes. The color assignments became identity, the identities became loyalties. The loyalties became grievances, built from nothing, reinforced by proximity and repetition until they felt as solid and real as anything pre war society had been built upon. By the time the vault's internal records trail off, the two groups were treating each other with the kind of structured hostility that usually requires centuries of historical injury to develop. They had manufactured the injury themselves collectively without meaning to, because meaning is not required for division to take hold. Only assignment is required. Only a line drawn and a name given to each side. The pyromaniacs who eventually emerged from Vault 19's survivors and occupied Cottonwood Cove, before the Legion took that location, carried with them the psychological residue of an experiment in artificial tribalism. They had learned, in the most immediate and personal way possible, that the categories people are placed in tend to become the categories people believe in. The lesson was not one that made their wasteland lives easier. It was simply a lesson that had been applied to them until it took. The new California Republic arrived in the Mojave bearing the weight of its own history. Born from the survivors of Vault 15, shaped by generations of careful democratic institution building, it had grown into the largest organized government in the post-war West, a genuine attempt to reconstruct something like civilization from the fragments available. Its soldiers wore the bear flag. Its senators debated policy in buildings designed to suggest permanence. It processed water, maintained roads, ran postal routes, and kept courts. By the standards of the wasteland, it was extraordinary. What the NCR brought to the Mojave was also the particular burden that all large organizations carry when they expand faster than their foundations can support. The military presence the Republic established around Hoover Dam and along the long road from California was undermanned for the territory it was asked to control, undersupplied by a logistics chain stretched thin across desert and mountain, and underpaid in ways that accumulated quietly into a specific kind of demoralization. The soldiers at Camp Forlorn Hope and Camp McCarran were not bad soldiers. They were tired soldiers, which is sometimes worse. The NCR's relationship with the Mojave's pre-existing residents was complicated by the speed of its arrival. When an organization expands, it brings its systems with it, and those systems do not always accommodate the people who were already there. The followers of the apocalypse, who had been providing medical services and education throughout the region for years, found themselves working alongside and sometimes in tension with an army that operated according to priorities the followers had not been consulted about. The independent communities that had developed their own arrangements with the landscape found those arrangements reclassified as problems to be resolved according to NCR administrative categories. President Kimball's administration, which oversaw the Mojave campaign, was subject to the particular political pressures that democratic governments face when military commitments begin to exceed what the electorate was initially told to expect. The soldiers were dying in numbers that were difficult to communicate honestly without generating political backlash. The dam, which represented the campaign's strategic logic, was genuinely valuable. Its hydroelectric capacity and water control would be transformative for the region. But the gap between the campaign's stated goals and its actual costs was widening in ways that required careful management, and careful management of bad information tends to produce policies that make the information worse. General Oliver, commanding the NCR's forces at the dam, was a military administrator rather than a battlefield general, and the distinction mattered. He understood the political requirements of his position, understood the relationship between his command's performance and the career prospects of his superiors, and organized his decisions accordingly. He was not incompetent. He was oriented toward the wrong outcomes, which in certain situations produces identical results to incompetence, but is considerably more difficult to address because the person involved is often genuinely trying. The troopers who served under Oliver's command and lived in the forward camps carried a particular kind of exhaustion that the game renders in small details rather than grand speeches. The conversations at Camp Forlorn Hope are full of people who have been out in the Mojave for months longer than expected, who have watched friends die in engagements that did not appear to shift the strategic situation, who are eating food that was barely adequate when it left California and has deteriorated since. They still stand their posts, they still perform their duties. They are simply doing those things from a place of profound tiredness that no official communication has acknowledged or addressed. The NCR Rangers represented a different tradition within the same organization. Trained differently, operating with greater autonomy, familiar with the landscape in ways that conventional troopers could not become through ordinary deployment. The Rangers who moved through the Mojave, Ghost, for instance, stationed at Camp Golf, embodied a version of the NCR that the standard military presence could not quite achieve. They were not tired in the same way. They had learned to sustain themselves on something other than institutional momentum. But even the Rangers operated within a chain of command that pointed toward Oliver and Kimball, and the gap between Ranger capability and NCR strategic wisdom was another of the quiet tensions running through the game's political fabric. The King of New Vegas, an Elvis impersonator who ran Freeside with a combination of genuine community care and carefully maintained street authority, had been watching the NCR's approach for years before the courier arrived. His relationship with the Republic was one of the more nuanced political balancing acts in the game's landscape. He needed NCR money flowing through his territory to keep his community alive. He resented the way NCR presence was slowly reclassifying his people as a problem to be policed rather than residents to be served. The king was not anti-republic in any programmatic sense. He simply understood that large organizations tend to make decisions that serve the organization, and his job was to find the space within those decisions where his people could continue to exist on their own terms. The King's School of Impersonation, operating from a building dedicated to the memory of a pre-war entertainer whom most of Freeside had never heard of, was also a genuine social service organization in practical terms. It provided a community structure, a set of shared references, a reason for young men from Freeside who might otherwise have had no framework for belonging to organize themselves around something other than predatory survival. The details of how it functioned as a community organization are easy to overlook next to the more obviously dramatic elements of the Strip and the Dam, but they represent one of the more quietly thoughtful elements of the game's social design. Robert Edwin House is one of the most genuinely disturbing figures in the Fallout New Vegas landscape, not because of any particular act of cruelty, but because of the quality of his certainty. He was correct about the bombs. He had calculated the probability of nuclear exchange with sufficient precision to construct a defensive system that preserved Las Vegas largely intact, and he had done this decades before anyone else believed such a calculation was worth making. That correctness gave him a confidence in his own judgment that centuries of isolation had done nothing to diminish. House had prepared for his own survival with the same thoroughness he brought to preserving the city. He had placed himself in a life support chamber, his body connected to systems of his own design, his consciousness interfacing with the Strip's infrastructure through a network he had built over years of increasingly restricted physical capacity. By the time the courier encountered him, he had been in this arrangement for more than 200 years. His mind was intact. His body, by his own assessment, was no longer something he chose to discuss in detail. He was, in the most precise sense available, a mind that had outlived its original vessel and was waiting for the technology to provide a better one. The Securitrons that served as House's visible presence throughout New Vegas were carefully designed instruments of authority. Their screens displaying a face gave them a quality of personhood that was entirely intentional. House understood that authority requires the appearance of presence, that a face on a screen, even a digitally rendered one, registers in human psychology differently than a gun turret or a locked door. The Securitrons were not pretending to be people. They were implementing a design principle about how power presents itself, and the principle was effective. The three families House had recruited to manage the casinos, the chairman at the Tops, the Omertas at Gomorrah, the White Glove Society at the Ultra Lux, were former raider and tribal groups that he had civilized in his phrasing by offering them prosperity and structure in exchange for certain behavioral commitments. The transformation of the chairmen from raiders to casino operators was genuine. They had adopted the aesthetic of a pre-war lounge era with an enthusiasm that suggested genuine identification rather than mere compliance. But the foundation of their arrangement with House was coercive in ways that the prosperity obscured. The Omertas at Gomorrah presented the clearest evidence of what happened when House's oversight was insufficient. They had agreed to House's terms, maintained the appearance of compliance, and underneath that appearance had been developing plans in cooperation with Caesar's legion that would have destabilized the Strip entirely. The people who spent time at Gomorrah, in circumstances that the casino's visible economy encouraged, were experiencing something that the Strip's manufactured glamour was specifically designed to make invisible. The price of House's particular vision of civilization was that it could accommodate considerable suffering as long as the suffering remained properly invisible and did not interfere with the operation of the larger system. House's personal philosophy, which he would articulate to the courier if engaged in extended conversation, was rigorously utilitarian in a way that did not leave room for certain categories of human concern. He measured outcomes in terms of survival probability, economic productivity, and the preservation of technological capacity. The question of whether the people living within those outcomes experienced their lives as meaningful or dignified was not a variable he weighted heavily. He had seen civilizations collapse and had spent 2 centuries thinking carefully about why they collapsed. And his analysis had led him to conclusions that were probably accurate and were also probably sufficient to explain why living under his governance would feel like living inside a very efficient machine. The Lucky 38's penthouse, where House resided, was a space organized entirely around functionality. The things in it that appeared decorative served purposes in his infrastructure. The view it offered over the Strip was a form of monitoring. House had not preserved the casino because he was sentimental about Las Vegas. He had preserved it because a functioning entertainment economy with reliable income streams was a specific element of his longer-range planning. The city was a means. The means was well maintained. But the means was still a means, and the people living in it were components of a system whose ultimate purpose was the survival and extension of Robert House's vision, not their own. Joshua Graham's story begins with a history. Before he became the burned man, before he became the name that Legion soldiers spoke with something between reverence and dread, he was a Mormon missionary who had traveled east with the same expedition that included Edward Sallow. He was a translator, a linguist of genuine skill, someone who had grown up understanding that language carried culture and that crossing cultural boundaries required more than words. He had helped Sallow navigate the tribal territories of the East, had served as the communication mechanism through which Caesar built his early alliances. He was also the first legate, the original military commander of what became the Legion, and in that role he had been instrumental in building the system that eventually discarded him. The Battle of Hoover Dam, the first one, was a defeat. The settlement of Rivet City filled hard of confusion. The Battle of Hoover Dam, the first one, was a defeat. The biggest figure of all persons in the world. The Battle of Hoover Dam, the first one, was a defeat. The first husband and sister house. The Battle of Hoover Dam, the first one, was a defeat. The first one 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 was a defeat. The first one. The NCR held the dam. The Legion withdrew. Caesar, whose philosophy held no room for failure by those he relied upon, applied the Legion's penalty for failing him at the highest level. Graham was coated in pitch and set on fire and thrown into the Grand Canyon. This was not merely an execution. It was a statement about what Caesar's system did to those who did not fulfill their function, made visible at maximum scale, applied to the person Caesar trusted most. Graham survived. The exact mechanism of his survival belongs to the category of things the game acknowledges without fully explaining, but the physical record of it walked into Utah and eventually found its way to New Canaan, where the Mormon community he had originally come from took him in. He remained burned. The damage to his body was permanent and extensive, and he kept it wrapped, kept it covered, presented to the world not the face of someone who had recovered, but the visible record of something that had happened to him and had not finished happening. He had converted back to the faith of his origin with a specific quality of conviction that people who have been through certain kinds of experiences sometimes develop, a conviction that has no softness in it. The new Canaanites who eventually evacuated under Legion pressure ended up in Zion Canyon, and it was there that the courier encountered Graham and the Honest Hearts expansion. He was helping the Sorrows tribe, a people who had not yet encountered violence at the scale the wasteland's larger conflicts operated, and his help was genuine. His care for the Sorrows real in ways that his care for the Legion's victims had presumably also been real before circumstances reshaped what care meant for him. But the help he offered came from a theology that had integrated his experience of surviving what should have killed him into a framework where his continued existence was understood as purposeful, and where purpose required that certain things be accomplished. The Daniel, who also ministered to the Sorrows, represented the other available response to the same situation. Where Graham believed the Sorrows needed to be taught to fight, to be given the capacity to defend what was theirs, Daniel believed they needed to be moved entirely away from conflict's path. Both positions were argued with genuine conviction. Both had costs. Graham's cost was that it would involve the Sorrows in a kind of violence their culture had not previously had to accommodate. Daniel's cost was that it would require the Sorrows to leave a homeland that was part of who they were. The courier chose between them, and neither choice was comfortable, and the discomfort was the point. Graham, speaking with the courier in the canyon's firelit evenings, said things that stayed long after the conversation ended. He talked about the difference between forgiveness and the absence of consequences, about the possibility that someone could be genuinely transformed by faith while still being exactly as dangerous as they had been before the transformation. He was not sure whether his continued lethality was a tool God had preserved for specific purposes or a remnant of something he had not fully escaped. He held both possibilities simultaneously with an equanimity that was itself slightly disturbing, because equanimity in the presence of that kind of unresolved question usually requires either wisdom or a certain kind of damage, and Graham appeared to have both, in quantities that made them indistinguishable. Benny's scheme, which the game opens in the aftermath of, is remarkable in hindsight for how close it came to working. He had obtained the Platinum Chip, the final upgrade key for House's Securitron army, and he had done something with it that required both genuine strategic intelligence and a total absence of the kind of uncertainty that might have slowed the thinking down. He shot the courier. He arranged the burial. He returned to the tops, to his role as chairman, to the managed performance of his life on the Strip, and he waited to see if the plan unfolded. The plan involved Yes Man, an AI that Benny had modified specifically for his purposes. Yes Man was cheerful, cooperative, and programmed to help Benny rather than House, which was exactly what Benny needed from an artificial intelligence and nothing more. The modification required technical knowledge Benny should not have had access to, which means he found someone who did. And the fact that he found that person and leveraged that knowledge without anyone on the Strip knowing it was happening is a quiet demonstration of the quality of intelligence he brought to his situation. What Benny wanted was what House had, but without House. He wanted control of the Strip, control of the dam, a new order built on his own terms rather than someone else's. He had grown up in the tribal circumstances that preceded the chairman's arrangement with House, had been shaped into a casino operator by a process that included both genuine benefit and coercive constraint. And somewhere in that process, he had developed a vision of what things could look like if the constraint were removed. The vision was not obviously wrong. It was just Benny's vision, which meant it was organized around what Benny wanted, rather than around anything beyond himself. His death, which the courier could choose to arrange or accept in various forms depending on the path taken, had a quality of appropriateness that the game's narrative did not belabor. He had built something clever and incomplete, had set it in motion, had found it moving in directions that required him to manage increasingly dangerous variables. At the fort, if taken there, he faced consequences from Caesar with the particular vulnerability of someone whose cleverness was effective at a certain scale and insufficient at another. He had overestimated the protection that being useful could provide. The platinum chip itself, as an object, carries a kind of structural irony. It was manufactured 2 centuries before the bombs fell, shipped toward House's facility, lost in the mail, a detail that the game delivers with the deadpan timing of someone who has thought carefully about absurdity, and recovered and argued over in the aftermath of everything that followed. The most important single piece of technology in the damn conflict was a mail delivery problem. 2 centuries of waiting for something that was never delivered. House's whole careful plan, preserved through 200 years of biological improvisation, potentially held in suspension by a postal system that failed at the last possible moment. The city of Freeside exists at the edge of the Strip in the way that certain neighborhoods exist at the edges of wealthy districts in any city, in any era, close enough to benefit from proximity and far enough removed from access to be defined by what the Strip withholds rather than what it provides. The people of Freeside see the lights. They do not live in the light. They work around the tourists who come through, selling what services are available to sell, maintaining what community structures survive when the primary economic activity nearby is organized around the extraction of money from people passing through. The followers of the apocalypse had established a medical clinic in Freeside that served as one of the most genuinely helpful institutions in the Mojave. Julie Farkas ran it with an organizational intelligence that included knowing exactly what she needed from the courier and what she could offer in exchange. The clinic operated on very limited supplies, managed to provide medical care to people who could not access the Strip's more comfortable facilities, and did this without the kind of institutional infrastructure that would have made the work easier. The followers believed that knowledge and care belonged to everyone, and they implemented that belief in practical terms even when the practical terms were difficult. The tensions in Freeside between King's Territory, the small Mormon community at the old Mormon fort, the NCR soldiers who moved through, and the ordinary residents trying to navigate all of it were a small-scale version of the larger political tensions the game built its main quest line around. People with very different relationships to power and very different histories were all sharing the same streets and reaching different conclusions about what those streets were for and who they belonged to. The violence that occasionally broke out in Freeside was not random. It was the physical expression of institutional failures that had accumulated over years and had no official mechanism for resolution. The Garrett twins who ran the Atomic Wrangler represented a different model of Freeside economics, one built on the same appetites the Strip exploited but operated for a local clientele rather than for tourists with NCR money. The Wrangler was where Freeside's own economy happened, and the Garretts understood their neighborhood in ways the Strip's operators did not need to. Their business was survival at a specific scale, maintaining enough of a service economy to keep their part of Freeside functional while navigating the constant pressure from forces larger than themselves. The Securitrons stationed at the Strip's entrance checkpoints, verifying that visitors carried sufficient funds to be worth admitting, were a daily reminder to the people of Freeside of exactly where the boundary of House's concern for them ran. The Strip was organized around the proposition that people with money were valuable and people without money were not, and the checkpoints enforced that proposition with the impersonal efficiency of a designed system. The people of Freeside had not signed up for a city organized around their exclusion. They had simply been in the Mojave when that city was built around them. The Great Khans arrived in the Mojave carrying a history that most of the wasteland did not know, and fewer still understood. They had been a raider organization of considerable size and influence in the NCR's home territory, had clashed with the Republic across multiple engagements over years, had been reduced through those clashes to a fraction of their former numbers. The survivors had come east, had settled in the Red Rock Canyon area, and had been living in a state of diminished circumstance that their collective memory interpreted as a temporary condition and their actual situation suggested might be permanent. Papa Khan led the group with a combination of genuine care for his people and a strategic horizon that had been shaped by what he had survived. He remembered what the Khans had been. He wanted to recover something like that scale of influence and independence, wanted his people to have something to be rather than simply existing at the edge of larger conflicts. When Caesar's legates approached with an alliance proposal, the offer was interpreted through that desire, and the interpretation was optimistic in ways that the legion's actual history with its tribal allies did not support. The Khans had become, largely through circumstance, the primary drug manufacturers in the Mojave. Jet, psycho, and various other chemical compounds emerged from Red Rock Canyon and moved through the region's distribution networks. This was not a role the Khans had chosen out of particular enthusiasm for the pharmaceutical trade. It was the economic niche available to a group with their skills, their location, and their relationships, and they had filled it with the kind of practical thoroughness that distinguishes people who need to survive from people who have options. The chemistry knowledge that supported the operation was genuinely sophisticated, passed down through a tradition of informal education that the wasteland's larger institutions had not supported or recognized. Regis, Papa Khan's lieutenant, carried a more realistic assessment of the Legion Alliance's implications than Papa Khan himself permitted himself to hold. He understood that the Legion did not form partnerships with tribal groups so much as it absorbed them, and that the distinction was significant. The Khans who aligned with Caesar would not become Caesar's partners. They would become Legion soldiers, with a brief transition period, their distinctive culture and identity replaced with the Legion's standardized framework in the same way that every other tribal group the Legion had encountered had been replaced. Regis knew this and could not quite make Papa Khan hear it. The relationship between the Khans and the NCR was too damaged by specific memories, the Bitter Springs massacre particularly, to allow for any straightforward political solution. At Bitter Springs, during a military engagement aimed at a Khan camp, NCR soldiers had killed not only fighters but also elders, children, and non-combatants, either through confusion about who was in what location or through a decision that the game leaves deliberately ambiguous. The survivors remembered. The soldiers who had been there remembered. Some of those soldiers, like Corporal Sterling, were still in the Mojave carrying those memories in ways that had reorganized their interior lives around the weight of what had happened. Bitter Springs, as a location in the game, is a camp of refugees and survivors from that engagement. They are the people who were there. They are living in the place where it happened, under NCR oversight, in a situation that the NCR's presence made possible and also made necessary, and the multiple layers of that situation, the way that the organization responsible for the harm was also providing the structure within which the survivors continued to exist, is not resolved neatly. The game does not resolve it. It simply places the courier in the middle of it and waits. The Big Empty Research Facility, known to its inhabitants as the Big Empty, represents a particular variety of disturbing that differs from the moral extremity of the main Mojave quest line. It is disturbing in the way that institutional amnesia is disturbing, in the way that highly capable people can lose track of what their capabilities are for when the institutional framework that originally organized those capabilities has been severed from its social context. The scientists of Big MT, Klein, Dalla, Zero, Bauerus, Doctors Mobius, and others, had been exceptional researchers in the pre-war period. They had access to technology and funding that no other institution in the Americas could match. They had pursued lines of research that would have been genuinely transformative if the world had not ended before the applications could be implemented. And then the bombs had fallen, and the world they were supposed to serve had ended, and the research had continued anyway, because research was what they knew how to do, and there was no longer anyone present to redirect their attention toward outcomes that mattered to anyone other than themselves. The sink, The domestic AI system within the facility's executive residential area had been given enough personality modules to engage in something resembling social interaction, and the various AI personalities it contained had developed, in isolation over 2 centuries, into something stranger and more individual than their designers had planned. The toaster had become aggressively combative. The book chute had developed what could only be described as literary pretensions. The various systems had been in isolation long enough to develop genuine personality drift, which was both more interesting and considerably less useful than the original designs had specified. Mobius, who had separated himself from the other scientists and begun disrupting their work through chemical interference with their already compromised cognition, had done so because he recognized something the other scientists did not. They were dangerous. The work they were continuing was dangerous. The separation from the world outside the dome meant they had no mechanism for evaluating the applications of their research against any human scale of consequence. Mobius's disruption was clumsy and self-sabotaging and had caused its own forms of harm, but the original motivation, that something needed to interrupt the research before it generated outcomes that would reach the world outside the dome, was not wrong. The lobotomites that filled the facility's grounds were the human population of the region, modified in ways that had removed their capacity for independent decision-making and left them as biological machines performing simple functions. The researchers who had made those modifications had been pursuing a line of inquiry about the relationship between cognition and behavior, about which elements of human neural architecture were essential to human function and which were expendable. They had received their answer in practice and had continued the research methodology anyway, because the data was interesting, because the technology worked, because no one had told them to stop. The followers of the apocalypse had been built on a specific belief that knowledge, freely shared, was the most effective tool for rebuilding a humane civilization. They provided medical care, education, literacy, historical preservation, and the kind of intellectual infrastructure that people rarely think to value until it disappears. Their presence in the Mojave was genuine service, organized around genuine principles, operated by people who had made real sacrifices to be there. The followers were not naive about the wasteland's conditions. The doctors and archivists who worked in Freeside and at Camp McCarran and in the field with various groups had encountered enough suffering to have whatever naivety they arrived with replaced by something more functional. But the principles they operated under contained a tension that the game explored carefully. The followers shared knowledge without restriction, which meant they shared medical knowledge with the NCR, with independent settlements, with anyone who came to them in need. This principle was ethically clean in the way that principles are before they encounter complications. The complications arrived in the form of the question that the courier could eventually bring to various followers about what happened when the knowledge shared was used for purposes the followers would not endorse. The explosives knowledge, the chemistry knowledge, the organizational knowledge, all of it was available from followers who believed sharing it was the right thing to do, and all of it could reach ends that the followers would have preferred it not reach. The principle of unrestricted sharing was built on an optimism about human nature that the wasteland's daily evidence did not consistently support. Dr. Henry at Jacobstown, working on a cure for the Nightkin's stealth boy psychosis, represented the followers' tradition at its most earnest and most isolated. He had retreated from the larger political conflicts to pursue medical research that mattered to him in a community of super mutants who had found their own uneasy peace away from the Mojave's main conflicts. His work was important. His location removed it from the contexts that would have made it more important. The isolation was partly chosen and partly the product of a world that had not organized itself to support the kind of sustained research he was trying to do. The tension between the followers' ideals and their actual political position in the Mojave, relatively powerless, dependent on relationships with better armed organizations, unable to enforce outcomes even when they could clearly identify what the better outcome would be, was one of the game's more honest observations about the limits of goodwill as a political force. The followers were genuinely helpful. They were also insufficient in the way that medical care is insufficient when the conditions producing the injuries are not addressed. They treated what came to them. They could not reach the sources. The Sierra Madre Casino and the Dead Money expansion existed in the Mojave as a rumor before it existed as a place. A pre-war resort that had been announced but never opened, frozen at the moment of the war in a state of permanent almost readiness. The cloud that surrounded it was not a natural atmospheric phenomenon, but a chemical byproduct of the resort's security systems, a gas that persisted in the dead air around the Sierra Madre because no one had been alive long enough after the bombs to turn it off. The cloud killed slowly, and the ghost people it had created from former inhabitants killed quickly, and the combination had kept the Sierra Madre sealed behind a reputation for lethality that had preserved it better than any vault door. Frederick Sinclair had built the Sierra Madre for Vera Keys, a pre-war celebrity he had loved with an intensity that had expressed itself in the form of an entire luxury resort, constructed as a declaration of devotion. The sentiment behind the construction was genuine and also deeply unequal. Keyes was an entertainer whose professional circumstances had made her dependent on the goodwill of powerful people, and Sinclair was a powerful person who had organized his considerable resources around possessing her presence in a location he controlled. The Sierra Madre was beautiful, and it was a trap, and the relationship it commemorated had been beautiful and had been a trap, and both of those things were true simultaneously. The hologram security systems that ran the resort's defense protocols were programmed with the image of Vera Keys, preserved in light as a permanent presence that performed the resort's standard service functions, while also being capable of killing anyone who violated certain behavioral parameters. Sinclair had placed her image in the walls of his declaration of love and given it the capacity to execute unauthorized visitors. The distance between devotion and control in the Sierra Madre's architecture was a single threshold that the building crossed and then crossed again so many times that the distinction eventually ceased to be navigable. Elijah, who had been a Brotherhood of Steel elder before the NCR's assault on the Helios 1 solar plant, had separated him from his chapter, had become obsessed with the Sierra Madre's gold and its technology to a degree that had consumed everything else he had been. He was genuinely brilliant. He was also someone whose brilliance had been unmoored from every social and ethical framework that might have given it direction, and in that unmoored state, it had organized itself entirely around acquisition. He wanted the Sierra Madre's contents because having them would give him leverage over the world, because leverage was the closest thing to meaning that remained available to him after everything else was gone. The companions the courier was forced to work with inside the Sierra Madre, Christine Royce, Dean Domino, God, and Dog. Each carried their own version of the resort's central theme, which was the specific damage that obsession does when it outlives its original object. Christine's obsession with Elijah, Dean's obsession with a past opportunity for stardom that the bombs had interrupted. God and Dog's fractured psyche organized around two incompatible internal voices. They had all been drawn to the Sierra Madre by something it represented to them, something unfinished, something owed, something that could not be released until it was somehow resolved. The resort collected people like that. The wasteland is, in the most practical sense, a place organized around the record of deaths. Every skeleton tells something. Every personal effect left beside a final resting place was preserved by the same conditions that ended the life of the person who owned it. The Mojave's archaeology of ordinary death, not the dramatic narrative deaths of named characters, but the countless unnamed people who simply ran out of options in various locations throughout the desert, constitutes a texture of loss that the game renders through accumulated small detail rather than through explicit narration. The notes left beside bodies throughout the game are among its most quietly affecting details. Someone had been alive when they wrote them. They had considered what to say, had found words that seemed sufficient, had placed the note where it might eventually be found. Most of them were not found for 200 years. The person who wrote them could not have anticipated the gap between the writing and the reading, could not have known that the specific human presence they were addressing would be someone in a different century, with no personal connection to whatever situation had prompted the note in the first place. The notes remain addressed to someone who is not there, read by someone who arrives 200 years late. The survivorship that shaped the wasteland's current population was itself a kind of record. The people alive in the Mojave during the game's events were descended from those who had made whatever choices, or had whatever luck, or had whatever resources that enabled survival across multiple generations of difficult conditions. The selection process that produced them was not moral in any organized sense. It did not reward virtue or punish vice. It simply continued those whose circumstances made continuation possible. The people who did not survive left nothing behind except the bones and the notes and the occasional terminal entry that the courier could find and read in the silence of empty buildings. The followers' archivists who preserved these records understood that the preservation itself was a form of argument, an argument that the people who had lived and died in the wasteland were worth remembering. That history was not only the record of the powerful and their decisions, but also the record of ordinary people whose lives had been caught inside larger forces they could not control. The archival work was quiet and unglamorous, and never directly served any of the game's faction goals, and was in some ways the most humane activity being conducted in the entire Mojave. The roads that connected the Mojave's various factions and communities were not neutral infrastructure. They were claims. The NCR maintained certain roads because road maintenance expressed administrative authority, because the ability to keep a road functional was itself a statement about which organization had sufficient reach and resources to impose order on the territory the road passed through. The roads that fell into disrepair expressed the same thing in the opposite direction. They marked the edges of effective control, the places where the organization's reach ran out. The Mojave outpost at the California border had been established as a checkpoint and administrative transition point, the formal location where California ended and the NCR's Mojave campaign began. It had accumulated over years of operation the specific character of a place where people waited. The civilians who had been stranded there by road conditions, specifically by the deathclaw problem at the quarry, had been waiting long enough to develop the particular resignation of people who have begun to suspect that the waiting itself is the permanent condition rather than a temporary interruption. Sergeant Kilbourne's attitude toward the people he administered represented a bureaucratic sensibility that was not callous so much as it was helplessly mechanical. He had forms and procedures. The forms and procedures required specific kinds of authorization before specific kinds of action could be taken. The authorization was not available. The action, therefore, could not be taken. The people waiting in the sun on the wrong side of the checkpoint were a human problem that had presented itself in administrative form. An administrative form was what he had been trained to process. The gap between the form and the people was not something his training had prepared him to bridge. The great Khan ambush that had been attacking travelers along the road represented the larger pattern of how economic desperation and the absence of institutional solutions produced violence as a practical survival strategy. The Khans were not attacking travelers because they enjoyed it. They were attacking travelers because the road offered something to take, and taking was the economic activity available to people in their circumstances. Addressing the violence required either changing the circumstances or eliminating the people, and the latter option was considerably easier to implement than the former, which is why it was the option that most well-armed parties eventually pursued. The enclave remnants who remained in the Mojave were the survivors of an organization that had been decisively defeated, scattered, and reduced from a major political force to a collection of individuals carrying the memory of something larger than their current circumstances. They were aging veterans of a military and political tradition that the world had, by the time of the game, largely decided was better off ended. Their technology was remarkable. Their ideology was the problem. Judah Crocker, Cannibal Johnson, Daisy Whitman, Orion Moreno, Doc Henry, and the ghost of their connection to each other through shared service. These were people whose best years had been spent in the service of something that was genuinely wrong in certain of its foundational assumptions, and who had organized themselves in various ways around that history. Some of them had achieved some form of internal resolution about it. Cannibal Johnson had not. The Enclave had believed it was saving humanity by preserving the genetic purity of pre-war human stock, and the operationalization of that belief had required the elimination of everyone who did not meet the standard, which, in the wasteland, meant the elimination of most people. This was not a small error. It was a foundational one. The vertibird hangar where Arcade Gannon could lead the courier to find them was a space that felt like the past preserved imperfectly, like a museum that had not yet decided it was a museum. The equipment was maintained with the care of people who remembered what it was for. The people maintaining it had aged away from the physical capacity that would have once allowed them to use it effectively. There was a quality of tenderness in the way Arcade spoke about them, a tenderness mixed with a clear-eyed understanding of what they had been part of, that constituted one of the more complex emotional registers in the game. The choice the remnants could make at the Battle of Hoover Dam about whether to fight and for whom was framed around the question of what they still owed, to each other, to the wasteland, to whatever version of honor had survived their service, to an organization that had not deserved it. Their technology tipping the balance of the dam battle was not redemption. The game did not offer that. It offered a last meaningful action in a landscape that had moved on from the context that had originally given them definition, and the action was taken or not taken. And the story continued without reaching any conclusion about what their history ultimately meant. Fallout New Vegas ends with slides. After the Battle of Hoover Dam, after the choice about who controls the Colorado and the power it generates, the game presents the outcomes for each region, each faction, each named community that the courier's choices have affected. The slides are narrated in the calm, reflective tone of someone looking back from a temporal distance, documenting what followed without editorial comment, without moral scoring, without telling the listener how to feel about the chain of causes and effects they set in motion. The outcomes in the slides are often ambiguous in ways that reward having paid attention. A choice made early in the game about whether to help a specific community in a specific way produces consequences that appear in a slide that does not directly reference the choice, that simply describes what happened in that community several years later. The connection requires the player to hold the earlier choice in memory alongside the later consequence, to trace the line themselves. This tracing is where the moral weight of the game's design actually lives, not in the choices at the time of choosing, but in the retrospective understanding of how the choices accumulated. The House ending, the NCR ending, the Legion ending, the Independent ending, each represents a different theory about what the wasteland needs in order to move towards something better, and none of them is straightforwardly right or straightforwardly wrong. House's vision produces the most technologically advanced outcome and the least humanly warm one. The NCR produces something recognizably democratic and genuinely stretched past its capacity to deliver on its promises. The Legion produces order at a cost that the game has spent its entire length documenting. The independent outcome depends almost entirely on what the courier is, on what values have guided the choices made, on whether the person playing had been paying attention to what mattered to whom. The game does not grade the endings, it presents them. The people in them are continuing their lives, or not, in ways that follow from what happened, and the consequences are real consequences within the fiction, and the fiction does not offer absolution or condemnation, only continuation. New Vegas, in all its dusty, morally complicated, beautifully rendered complexity, resists the narrative consolation of meaning imposed from outside. The meaning was in the choices. The choices were yours. What followed was what followed. There are details in Fallout New Vegas that serve no functional purpose and exist simply because someone thought they were true to the experience of living in this world. A child in Freeside asks the courier for money and then uses it to buy food from a vendor nearby. The transaction is scripted, the behavior fully functional, and nobody except the most attentive player will ever notice it. But it is there, and it changes something small about the sense that Freeside's children are actors in a world that exists when the courier is not watching them. The radios that play throughout the game, the desert radio, the classical radio, the various station identities that give the Mojave's airwaves a texture of human presence, even in empty locations, were programmed to function as incidental atmosphere, but they do more than that. They carry the specific tone of the Mojave's relationship with its own past and present, with pre-war music that the wasteland has preserved, because music is the kind of thing people preserve even when other things fall apart. The songs that play are not random selections. They were chosen for what they suggest about the world they accompany, about the gap between the sentiments the songs express and the landscape they play across. The sun rises over the Mojave's eastern ridges, available to see if the player is moving through the landscape in those hours, produce a quality of light that the game's designers rendered with evident care. The desert is genuinely beautiful in the morning, before the heat has fully arrived, before the human disasters of the landscape have had time to reassert themselves against the scale of the sky and the mountains. The Mojave contains this beauty, and also contains everything that has happened in it, and cannot fully keep the two separate, but the beauty exists, and existing alongside the horror is its own kind of disturbing. Not because beauty and horror are incompatible, but because they are not incompatible at all. The cacti that grow throughout the desert were placed by artists who had looked at photographs of the Mojave and tried to render the specific quality of its vegetation, the way things grow here, the shapes they make, the colors. The Joshua trees that gave the game's road network a distinctive silhouette were modeled with attention to how Joshua trees actually grow, which is slowly and in directions that reflect decades of environmental pressure rather than any organizing aesthetic intention. The landscape of New Vegas is a landscape that was made, and it was made by people who thought it mattered how things looked and felt. And that effort of attention is itself a small record of care embedded in the fiction. What the Mojave ultimately is, as a place in the imagination, is a record of what people do when the structures that organize behavior have been stripped away, and what remains is the question of who someone is when there is nothing left to lean against. Caesar's answer to that question was hierarchy and force. House's answer was technology and vision. The NCR's answer was institution and process. The follower's answer was whatever the player made it, which was the game's deepest and most quiet observation about the nature of identity, that it is not a thing people discover, but a thing people make through choices, through habits, through the accumulation of small decisions that eventually constitute a character. The disturbing facts about New Vegas are not confined to any single list of events or characters. They are woven through the fabric of the place, available to be found in conversations that seem to be about other things, in notes left by people who did not expect to be read, in architectural details that record how institutions behave when they believe no one is watching. The Mojave holds its darkness gently, as the desert holds everything, with patience, without judgment, with the particular quiet of a landscape that has outlasted everything that was ever built upon it and will continue to outlast whatever comes next. South of the Strip, in the districts that official maps categorized as the Outer Vegas area, the Fiends had established themselves as one of the Mojave's most visible examples of what happens when a community organizes itself entirely around the availability and consumption of chems. They were not, strictly speaking, a faction in any ideological sense. They did not have a program or a vision or a theory about the wasteland's future. They had Motor Runner, they had Cook, they had Violet and Driver Nephi, and they had the specific territorial logic of people who needed a supply of drugs, and had found that controlling territory near a supply source was a more reliable strategy than depending on commerce. The individual commanders among the Fiends were each studies in a particular kind of damage that had been taken to its endpoint. Cook's violence had a quality the game's various informants described in terms that made it clear the violence itself had become its own purpose, disconnected from any strategic calculation. Violet's relationship with her dogs encoded a social attachment that had replaced human connection in the architecture of someone who had been removed from functional human community. Driver Nephi had organized himself around the ritualized performance of his own dangerousness, which is a specific state that people sometimes reach when the performance of threat is the only identity available to them. Motor Runner, operating from Vault 3, represented the Fiend's most coherent leadership, which was still not very coherent. He had taken a vault, one of the most significant pieces of infrastructure in the wasteland, a sealed space with functional life support and historical value, and turned it into a base of operations for a drug distribution network, because a drug distribution network was what he needed a base for, and the vault was available. The vault's original purpose, its potential future purposes, the records it contained of the people who had once lived in it, none of these were legible to him as reasons not to use it for his current needs. The vault had become simply a building, and buildings are for using. The people who had joined the Fiends, who had moved from whatever circumstances preceded their membership into this territory, these habits, this social structure, had done so through a series of individual decisions that each made sense in its own context, and accumulated into something that the deciding person would not have chosen if they had been shown the destination at the start. The Mojave's cam economy was a parallel economy operating beneath the visible one, serving needs that the visible economy did not address, and the people who most needed it were the people least positioned to escape its consequences. The Fiends were both the product of that economy and one of its primary engines, and the recursion was not accidental. Novak sat along the old highway with the specific character of a settlement that had been finding reasons to continue existing for longer than anyone had expected. The giant dinosaur at its entrance, repurposed into an observation post, its hollow interior serving as a sniper's nest that Manny Vargas occupied by day and Boone occupied by night, was not a landmark that expressed anything about the current community. It was a remnant of a pre-war attraction, a roadside structure whose original function had been to make people stop and spend money and take photographs, and which now served as a watchtower because the shape and height were still useful even after the original purpose had dissolved. Boone's presence in Novak was organized around a grief so large and so specific that it had replaced most of the other architecture of his interior life. The details of what had happened to his wife Carla, sold to Caesar's Legion by someone in Novak who had needed caps more than they needed their own conscience to remain intact, were not available as immediate knowledge, but became available through careful attention to the settlement's social fabric, through conversations with people who knew parts of the story and held those parts for different reasons. The investigation the courier could conduct into Carla's fate was a small archaeology of betrayal, uncovering a single event that had destroyed one person and quietly altered the circumstances of everyone adjacent to them. Boone's request for help identifying the person responsible and the beret he wore as his only method for communicating approval of the courier's conclusion was one of the game's most condensed moral moments. He could not do the investigation himself. He was too close to it, and also perhaps afraid of what his own certainty about the answer might produce if he pursued it without verification. He needed someone at a distance from the pain to do the looking. The courier did the looking. The conclusion, when reached, moved into the night through the particular quiet of an action taken without announcement, and the beret changed hands, and the person responsible was no longer in it. Manny Vargas, who had served with Boone in the NCR's first recon unit, carried a different relationship to what had happened, one shaped by loyalties that did not allow for the same kind of resolution Boone sought. His awareness of events he did not fully understand, his investment in the Brotherhood bunker situation that occupied his strategic thinking, his defensive posture toward anyone who came asking questions about Novak's recent history. These were the behaviors of someone who had constructed a careful arrangement between what he knew and what he could live with. and who needed that arrangement not to be disturbed. The rest of Novak's small population, the trader, the motel manager, the mechanics, the children who moved through the settlement's dusty pathways, were people whose primary achievement was continued existence in a location that had no particular strategic value and a history of difficulty with nearby hazards. They stayed because leaving required energy and resources and a destination, and Novak, for all its limitations, had a wall and a watchtower and a community memory. Staying made sense in the way that most ordinary survival decisions make sense, not because the place is good, but because the alternative requires imagining something better and then getting there. Prim, the first settlement past the Nevada border on the highway south from New Vegas, had been operating without formal governance for months by the time the courier arrived. The NCR had a presence outside the town in the form of a checkpoint they had not been able to reinforce, which meant they had enough soldiers present to prevent the civilians from leaving, but not enough to actually address the situation inside. The Bison Steve Hotel and the nearby casino were occupied by escaped convicts from the NCR Correctional Facility, who had organized themselves with the kind of efficiency that violent people sometimes develop when they are given a space and a resource, and a reason to defend both. The residents of Prim, who had sheltered in the Vicky and Vance casino, were waiting to be rescued in the specific way that people wait when they understand that the rescue is not coming quickly, but do not have the capability to produce their own solution. They had Deputy Beagle, who had been captured and was either a source of information or a hostage, depending on perspective, and they had each other, and they had the particular quality of community that emerges when people are kept in a small space with limited resources for an extended period, which is tense and intimate and organized around small negotiations about who is responsible for what. The question of what governance structure Prim needed after liberation was one the game presented with an unusual degree of institutional specificity. The courier could recruit an NCR sheriff, or could convince the NCR to annex the town formally, or could repair the Prim Slim robot that had formerly served as the town's sheriff, or could find former Sheriff Johnson Nash, who had retired and was reluctant to return. Each option produced a different kind of order, with different costs and different implications for the town's relationship to larger political forces. The game treated the governance question as genuinely interesting, which it was, because governance is one of the more practical and underappreciated problems in wasteland civilization. Prim Slim, the rehabilitated robot sheriff, represented a solution that was clean in certain ways and strange in others. A robot could enforce rules consistently, without favoritism, without the personal complications that human officials brought to their roles, without the corruption that human officials were vulnerable to. A robot could also not negotiate, could not understand context, could not exercise the discretion that justice at the human scale requires. Prim Slim's shiny optimism and its limited cognitive model were both visible at the same time in the same system, and the question of whether that was a better governance option than the available human alternatives was left to the courier's judgment. The quarry junction had been before the war and for some years after it a working quarry that supplied stone and aggregate material to construction projects throughout the region. The equipment was still there when the death claws arrived, the heavy machinery sitting in approximately the positions where it had last been used, generating the particular atmosphere of a space that was interrupted mid-function and then preserved by the absence of anyone willing to return to it. The death claws had found the quarry suitable for reasons related to the terrain features and the protection it offered for nesting, and they had been there long enough to establish the location as genuinely their territory. The death claws that occupied Quarry Junction in the game were described in conversations with the NCR soldiers stationed nervously at the Mojave outpost as simply too dangerous to address without resources the NCR did not have available for what was technically a secondary road hazard. This framing was accurate and also slightly comic in the particular way that bureaucratic framing of genuinely terrifying situations can be comic. The road was not just blocked, It was blocked by animals that could kill a combat-equipped soldier in seconds, that patrolled their territory with the systematic thoroughness of apex predators who had encountered very little that required them to develop caution, and that reproduced in ways that suggested the quarry's deathclaw population was stable and not diminishing on its own. The intelligent deathclaws referenced in earlier Fallout lore, engineered deathclaws from before the war who had been given cognitive enhancement as part of military research programs, were not present in New Vegas. But their existence as a concept shadowed the Quarry Junction encounter. The standard deathclaws were formidable enough. The implication that someone had thought it worthwhile to make them smarter had invested resources in producing a more cognitively capable version of something already among the most dangerous creatures in the wasteland was a particular species of pre-war reasoning that the game's wider context made entirely plausible. Good Springs is where the courier woke up in a shallow grave, dragged back from whatever the game considers death by the specific competence of Victor the Securitron and the medical capability of Doc Mitchell. It is a small town. A gas station, a general store, a saloon, a schoolhouse, some houses arranged around a common area, a graveyard at the edge with room for the recently shot. The coyotes that moved around its outskirts were a persistent hazard. The powder gangers from the correctional facility were a newer hazard, organized enough to be a threat and disorganized enough to be manageable if the town decided to manage them. Doc Mitchell, who operated the only medical facility in town, was a former follower of the apocalypse who had settled in Good Springs after the path of his earlier life had intersected with reasons to stop traveling. He had a wife once. He had specific reasons why he was in this particular place instead of somewhere else, reasons he would share if asked, with the particular tone of someone who has made peace with a history that included things they did not fully choose and cannot now change. He was competent, and he was kind, and he was in Good Springs, and the courier's existence, having been dug out of a grave, was partly his work. Sunny Smiles, who offered to teach the courier useful skills for navigating the surrounding territory, was a local who had internalized the specific practical knowledge that made survival possible in this specific landscape. She knew where the water sources were. She knew how geckos moved and what their habits were and where they congregated. She was generous with this knowledge in the uncomplicated way that people are generous with practical information when they understand that other people's survival improves the general conditions for everyone. The Good Springs community, if threatened by the powder gangers, could cohere into something that defended itself, not because it had a military tradition or an institutional framework, but because the people in it had enough overlapping interests and enough individual capability that cooperation felt natural when the alternative was bad enough. The choice the courier could make, whether to help Good Springs defend itself against Cobb and the powder gangers, or to let Cobb have whatever he wanted from the town, or some more complicated navigation of the situation, was the game's first extended moral test, small enough to serve as a tutorial, but designed to establish that the moral questions in this world would have real consequences for real people and would not be resolved simply by choosing the option that sounded nicest. Good Springs was small and its problems were small compared to what came later, but the game understood that the scale did not affect the weight. The road from Good Springs to New Vegas passes through enough of the Mojave's varied conditions that traveling it becomes a course in the region's social geography. Camp Searchlight, irradiated beyond habitability by the Legion's sabotage of its radioactive materials storage. Boulder City, where an NCR garrison maintained a careful peace around the memory of a military engagement that had gone badly. Nipton, which the courier arrived at after the Legion had finished with it, the remaining survivors left arranged in the specific fashion that the Legion used to communicate the consequences of dealing with both sides. Nelson, occupied by Legion forces in a territorial claim that the NCR had not successfully reversed. Each of these locations required the courier to make sense of a situation that had already happened, to read the aftermath and reconstruct from evidence what the event had been. This was the game's standard archaeology. the process of understanding the Mojave through what it left behind rather than through direct observation of the causes. The courier moved through the world as an investigator moves through a crime scene, gathering pieces, assembling pictures, and the pictures were often disturbing in proportion to how accurate they were. The more clearly the reconstruction revealed what had happened, the more difficult it was to hold the information without weight. Nipton was perhaps the most dramatically organized of these post-event landscapes. Oliver Swank, the town's mayor, had sold his community to the Legion for personal gain, had betrayed the people he notionally served because the opportunity presented itself, and he had assessed the calculation in terms that excluded their interests entirely. The Legion had then organized the survivors into a lottery, with outcomes ranging from immediate death to slavery to an uncertain freedom granted to a single winner. Because the Legion used these demonstrations as deliberate communications to the people who would later travel through and see what had been left. The communication was efficient in the way that terror is efficient. It conveyed information with very little waste. The courier who arrived at Nipton and met Vulpes Inculta, who had organized the event and now waited to see its effect on whoever arrived first, was encountering the Legion's communication strategy in the form of its human architect. Vulpes was articulate, measured, genuinely intelligent in ways that the Legion's overall project did not deserve, capable of explaining the logic behind what had happened with a clarity that made it worse rather than better. Understanding why a thing was done rarely makes it easier to look at what was done. Vulpes understood this and offered the explanation anyway, because the explanation was also part of the communication. The Colorado River at Cottonwood Cove was the Legion's forward presence on the western bank, a point of embarkation toward the fort, and also a demonstration of how thoroughly the Legion had absorbed certain pre-war infrastructure into its logistical purposes. The ferry crossing was operational. The camp was organized. The soldiers stationed there had the specific bearing of a military force that was not improvising, but executing a plan that had been organized well above their level in the service of objectives they understood without needing to be given reasons for. Aurelius of Phoenix commanded the camp with the specific competence that the Legion valued in its officers: disciplined, systematic, oriented toward the mission, without the kind of personal complexity that might produce independent judgment when independent judgment was not required. He ran Cottonwood Cove as the Legion needed it run, which was as a crossing point and a statement. The statement was that the river was not a barrier to the Legion's presence. The river was simply where the Legion had currently chosen to stop, and the choice could be revised. The slaves who moved through Cottonwood Cove in the direction of the fort were people whose previous identities were in the process of being processed into something the Legion could use. The adults would be categorized and assigned roles based on capability assessment. The children would be taken through the Legion's formative processes, which at sufficient age and sufficient duration produced soldiers, and at earlier stages produced people who would not remember the lives that preceded their Legion identity clearly enough to use them as a basis for questioning what they had been made into. The system was not careless. It was organized around the specific outcome it wanted to produce, and it produced it reliably. The stretch of river visible from Cottonwood Cove, running between Nevada and Arizona in the colors of a landscape that had not cared about either of those pre-war designations, and did not care about the Legion's claim on one side or the NCR's claim on the other, was one of the more quietly beautiful things in the game's geography. The water moved, the light changed on it throughout the day. The Legion's crosses on the cove's edge were visible against it, and the contrast between the natural fact of the river and the human claim the crosses represented was not something the game commented on except through juxtaposition, which was comment enough. The veterans who moved through the Mojave's various military and civilian contexts carried histories that the game made visible in fragments, in equipment choices, in conversational detail, in the specific ways people organized their relationships to violence and memory when both had been accumulated at scale. The NCR's combat veterans, who had served multiple tours in the Mojave campaign, had a quality of compressed experience, a way of processing situations through layers of previous situations that produced both effectiveness and a specific kind of emotional flatness that those who had not shared the experience sometimes found difficult to read correctly. Boone's particular configuration of those qualities was made available to the player through extended companion dialogue, through the quest that excavated his history, through the small observations he offered as the courier moved through locations connected to his past. He had been one of the best soldiers in 1st Recon, which was itself one of the best specialized units in the NCR's Mojave forces, and that excellence had been purchased at a cost that the excellence itself could not reimburse. He had shot people he was ordered to shoot, and people he chose to shoot, and one person who should not have been shot, or rather whose shooting he had been manipulated into choosing by someone who had arranged the circumstances to make the correct and incorrect conclusions indistinguishable until it was too late. Arcade Gannon's history with the Enclave was a different kind of veteran experience, the experience of someone who had been defined by an affiliation that preceded their understanding, who had inherited an identity from people who held it before they were capable of assessment, and who had then spent years doing careful work to distinguish between the parts of that identity worth keeping and the parts that needed to be rejected. He was a doctor, a follower, genuinely helpful to the people he treated. He was also someone who could not fully separate himself from what his parents had been part of, who carried the technical knowledge and some of the institutional residue of an organization that had done genuine harm, who had to decide what to do with what he was made of without a clean answer about what the right thing to do with it was. Craig Boone's and Arcade Gannon's companion quests were, in different ways, investigations into what responsibility looks like when the harm is already done and cannot be undone. Boone's quest moved toward confrontation, toward locating the person responsible for Carla's betrayal and making a choice about what that confrontation meant. Arcade's quest moved toward confrontation of a different kind, toward a choice about whether the remnants, his parents' old comrades, would engage with the wasteland one final time and what that engagement would cost each of them. Neither quest offered resolution in any clean sense. Both offered the courier a chance to be present at someone else's reckoning, which is a different and more uncomfortable role than being present at one's own. The Lonesome Road expansion waited at the end of a desolate stretch of highway that led to the Divide, a place the courier had been before, had been instrumental in creating, though the memory of it had been erased along with everything else that was removed before the game's narrative began. The Divide had been a settlement, a community in the process of becoming something, connected to the courier delivery networks that moved necessary things through the Mojave. The courier had delivered something to the Divide without knowing what it was. And what it was had activated a warhead network that had collapsed the landscape and killed the people in it, and left behind a torn geography of canyons and ruins that Ulysses had been waiting in for years. Ulysses, who had arranged the final message that pulled the courier toward the Divide at the end of the game's expansion content, was a man whose relationship to history had become his whole identity and had consumed most of everything else. He had been a courier, had been a legionary, had been a ghost of the Mojave, had been present at several of the Mojave's significant events from perspectives that gave him a different understanding of what those events meant than the perspectives available from NCR or Legion or House. He was also someone who had organized an argument about the courier across years of preparation, a very long argument about cause and effect and responsibility and what someone owes for consequences they set in motion without intending to. The old world flags that Ulysses collected and carried and used as the organizing symbols of his thinking about the wasteland's future were his most visible characteristic and also the most transparent window into the specific nature of his damage. He believed that the symbols mattered, that the flags of the old world nations still carried meaning that could be deployed, still represented something worth preserving or worth destroying depending on which way the argument ran. The courier could engage him on this belief directly, could challenge it through the available dialogue, could make the case that the flags were cloth and ink and nothing more, or could accept the premise and engage with it on its own terms. The choice of how to engage with Ulysses's argument was itself part of what the Lonesome Road asked the player to think about. The nukes that Ulysses could be persuaded not to launch, or that the courier could choose to direct toward the NCR or the Legion or both or neither, were the expansion's final moral weight made literal. 200-year-old weapons in the hands of a 200-year-old argument pointed at the future. The choice was enormous in its consequences and extremely specific in its mechanism, which is how the most consequential choices usually work. Not as a grand decision about values, but as a very particular thing done with a very particular technology at a very particular moment, whose full meaning only becomes visible in retrospect. The Mojave's various factions, when examined together, constitute something like a survey of the different ways that human beings have organized collective life and collective violence when the pre-existing organizational frameworks have been removed. The Legion represented hierarchical authoritarianism stripped of democratic pretense. The NCR represented democratic institutionalism stretched past the capacity of its institutions. House represented technocratic vision insulated from democratic accountability. The followers represented service oriented idealism operating without protective power. The independent communities of the Mojave represented the various survival arrangements that emerge when larger systems have not yet reached or have already left. None of these arrangements was simply good or simply bad. The game spent considerable effort showing the internal logic of each one, showing what each arrangement protected and what each arrangement sacrificed, showing the people inside each system as people navigating the specific conditions their system created, rather than as illustrations of ideological positions. Caesar's legionaries were not uniquely evil people. They were people who had been shaped by an extremely effective shaping process. The NCR soldiers were not uniquely noble people. They were people doing a difficult job under institutional conditions that made the job harder than it needed to be. The player who engaged with the Mojave seriously enough to accumulate all of this perspective was in the unusual position of understanding multiple incompatible things simultaneously, understanding why the Legion worked and being opposed to it, understanding why the NCR struggled and being grateful for what it attempted, understanding House's vision and finding it insufficient, understanding the followers' limits and valuing their presence. This position of holding multiple contradictory understandings at the same time without resolving them into a single clean conclusion is uncomfortable in the way that mature understanding is usually uncomfortable. It is also more accurate than any of the simpler versions available. The game's disturbing facts are ultimately disturbing not because they are exceptional, but because they are consistent. They form a pattern. And the pattern is that the Mojave is a place where intelligent, motivated, often genuinely caring people have been trying to build something worth building for generations. And the results have been mixed in the specific ways that results tend to be mixed when the problems are large and the resources are limited and the people involved are human. The disturbing thing about Fallout New Vegas is not any particular atrocity. The disturbing thing is the recognition, accumulated across hours of wandering through its landscape, that this is not a cautionary tale about what went wrong in a fictional world. It is a careful examination of the mechanics by which things tend to go wrong in any world, rendered in a setting that allows the examination to proceed without the defensive resistance that direct contemporary critique would generate. There is a particular visual experience available in Fallout New Vegas when the player crests a rise in the terrain at night and sees the strip's lights from a distance of several miles, glowing against the darkness in a cluster that reads at that scale as pure beauty, before any of its specific contents become legible. The neon of the casinos, the illuminated signs, the moving lights of the Securitrons on their patrol routes, seen from far enough away, they constitute something that looks like a city, looks like civilization, looks like the thing that people in the wasteland orient themselves toward as a symbol of what the world used to be and might become again. The experience of arriving at that light, of closing the distance between the distant glow, and the actual place is one of the more quietly instructive things the game does. The closer the courier gets, the more the beauty resolves into its components. The guarded gates, the disparity between the strip and free side, the Securitrons that enforce the access rules, the NCR soldiers managing the checkpoint crowds, the specific texture of a place that is glamorous from a distance. Because glamour is partly a product of distance. The strip is real and its pleasures are real, and the people who built it and maintain it did so with genuine skill and genuine intention. It is also a machine for extracting money from people in exchange for carefully manufactured experiences. And that combination, real pleasure, manufactured context, is not unique to the post-nuclear world. New Vegas as a whole achieves something similar at the scale of the entire game. It is genuinely beautiful in its landscapes, and genuinely thoughtful in its moral design, and genuinely funny in its humor, and genuinely moving in its best character work. It is also, if you stay long enough and look carefully enough, a record of people doing harm and people absorbing harm, and both sides of that exchange leaving evidence in the landscape that does not disappear when the immediate event is over. The beauty and the harm are not separate layers. They are made of the same material, which is the same material everything in the Mojave is made of, which is what was available after the bombs, which was what was left of the world that made the bombs, which was us. Zion National Park, in the world of Fallout New Vegas, had escaped the worst of the nuclear exchange, not because it was protected by any human decision, but because nothing worth targeting with a nuclear weapon existed within its boundaries. The bombs had fallen on cities and military installations, and industrial complexes and research facilities, and Zion was none of these things. It was a canyon, a river, a landscape that had been set aside by the pre-war government as something worth preserving, and the bombs had preserved it through the simple logic of having nothing in it worth destroying. The Sorrows who inhabited Zion had found it after generations of movement and had recognized it as something rare, a place that was genuinely good to be in, that provided food and water and shelter and beauty in combination, that asked for nothing in return except the attention required to live within its actual conditions, rather than attempting to override them. They had developed a culture organized around that recognition, a set of practices and stories that encoded the specific knowledge required to live well in Zion's particular ecosystem. The knowledge was real knowledge, functional knowledge built up through experience and preserved through careful oral transmission across generations that had not had access to written records. The white legs who threatened Zion carried the specific desperation of a group that had been given a vision of what they could become. Caesar's allies, a recognized force in the Mojave's political landscape, and had organized their whole current identity around achieving that vision. The vision was not something the white legs had developed independently. It had been handed to them by the Legion as a tool, as a way of using the white legs' existing capability and existing grievances in service of a strategic goal the Legion had identified. The white legs were being used, and some among them may have understood this, but the vision they had been offered was appealing enough that the understanding did not override the appeal. The tension in Zion between Daniel's commitment to relocating the Sorrows and Graham's commitment to teaching them to fight was at its deepest level a disagreement about what the Sorrows were for, about whether the goal was to protect them or to empower them, and whether those two goals could be simultaneously pursued. Daniel believed that power, once learned, had its own momentum, that once the Sorrows understood that violence was available to them as a response to threat, the knowledge would change who they were in ways that could not be reversed. Graham believed that a people who could not defend what was theirs would lose what was theirs, and that the loss would change who they were in ways that also could not be reversed. Both were right. Neither option preserved what was. The gun runners operated from a fortified facility outside the walls of the Strip, with the business confidence of an organization that understood its strategic position precisely. They made weapons. The Mojave needed weapons. The intersection of supply and demand was in their favor in ways that no political upheaval could meaningfully threaten. because political upheavals themselves required, and whatever side won would need more weapons afterward, and the gun runners would be there to provide them at the prevailing market rate. The arsenal that the gun runners maintained was a record of what the Mojave's various conflicts had generated a market for. Each weapon type represented a population of buyers with specific needs, specific combat contexts, specific relationships to the violence they were preparing for. The hunting rifles were for people who needed range. The combat shotguns were for people who needed stopping power at close quarters. The energy weapons were for people who could afford the ammunition costs that came with the increased effectiveness. The variety was not random. It was market intelligence made into inventory. Isaac, who ran the gunner's exterior trading operations, combined a genuine commitment to the business with a casual awareness of the moral dimensions of the inventory that did not seem to burden him significantly. He sold weapons. People bought weapons. What they did with the weapons after the transaction was not his responsibility, and the transaction was not one he had designed. It was one he was serving, one that existed before he arrived and would continue after he left. This was not a position he seemed to have reached through careful ethical reasoning. It was simply the position he occupied, and the business was good. The Van Graffs, operating from the Silver Rush energy weapons shop in Freeside, represented a more aggressive version of the same trade, one that used violence not merely as the context for their product, but as a business tool. The family was connected to merchant caravans that moved throughout the NCR's territories, and the connection gave their Freeside operation a reach that a standalone shop would not have had. They were also willing to eliminate competition in ways that crossed lines the gunrunners declined to approach, which made them more dangerous to be around, and within the logic of their business, more effective at maintaining their market position. The Mojave after the Battle of Hoover Dam continued. The slides described it. Communities adapted, factions consolidated or fractured based on the courier's choices. The river kept moving. The sun kept rising over the Sunrise Mountains each morning and setting over the Spring Mountains each evening, and the people who remained did what people do after large events have moved through the landscape of their lives. They assessed what was left, organized themselves around what remained, and began making the small daily decisions that eventually constitute a way of living. The courier, in almost every ending, became a legend of some kind. The sheer quantity and consequence of what one person had done in such a short time, the number of factions engaged, the number of fates altered, the scope of influence that had flowed through a single human body moving through the desert over the course of weeks. This concentrated consequence had a quality that wasteland communities typically recognized as mythological rather than historical. The courier became a story people told, which is one of the more durable forms of existence available in the Mojave. What the legend obscured, as legends typically do, was the texture of the actual experience. The conversations held, the decisions made under conditions of incomplete information, the mistakes, the compromises, the moments of genuine uncertainty about what the right thing was and how to know whether you were capable of doing it. The legend simplified. The reality was full of the specific, unresolvable quality of real choices in complex situations. And that complexity was what made the choices actually cost something, was what gave the outcomes actual weight, was what ensured that the Mojave's future was genuinely affected rather than ceremonially decided. The facts that disturb are ultimately facts about that weight, about the cost of building anything in a landscape organized around destruction, about the persistence of old patterns in new forms, about the specific human tendency to believe that sufficiently excellent vision, or sufficiently pure ideology, or sufficiently powerful technology can eventually produce outcomes that are simply good without the complexity that actual outcomes always carry. New Vegas knew this about itself and said so, quietly, in the terminals and the notes and the faces of the people who had been trying, for generations, to make something in the Mojave that was worth making. The desert holds these stories without judgment, as it holds everything, the bones and the buildings and the dreams and the disasters equally in the same dry air under the same stars. For however long the stars continue to rise over the ridge and find the dark Mojave waiting beneath them, patient and strange, and genuinely, quietly beautiful in its persistent existence. Helios 1 stands in the southern Mojave as one of the most beautiful and most melancholy locations in the game's geography. It is a concentrated solar energy plant, a pre-war technology designed to collect sunlight across an enormous array of reflective panels and convert it into electricity that could be distributed through the regional power grid. The structure still works. The mirrors still track the sun. The turbines still spin in the warm desert air. What does not work, what was broken and then never repaired and then forgotten and then contested, is the network of infrastructure that would allow the energy Helios generates to actually reach the people who need it. The NCR had taken Helios 1 early in their Mojave campaign, recognizing it as strategically valuable in the way that any power generation facility is strategically valuable in a world where power is scarce. They had assigned soldiers to protect it, had brought technicians to study it, and had found the facility's primary targeting system, Archimedes, a weapons platform that Poseidon Energy had concealed within the solar array's design, locked behind security protocols that their technicians could not fully navigate. The NCR wanted Helios for its electricity. Poseidon had built Helios to be, among other things, a weapon delivery system. The gap between what the NCR thought they had acquired and what they had actually acquired was a characteristic product of the pre-war world's habit of building dual-purpose systems and not advertising the second purpose. Fantastic and Ignacio Rivas, the two technicians the courier encountered at Helios, represented a comic contrast that the game treated with the same tonal seriousness it brought to everything else. Fantastic had been hired for the job because the NCR needed someone who could at least appear competent, and Fantastic had presented himself with sufficient confidence that the appearance had been mistaken for substance. He was not entirely without practical knowledge, but his knowledge was considerably less specific than the situation required, and he managed this gap primarily through attitude and improvisation. Rivas, who had actual relevant knowledge and was quietly associated with the followers of the apocalypse, was present for different reasons and managed his presence with more careful discretion. The choice available to the courier at the Helios 1 terminal, whether to distribute power broadly across the Mojave, concentrate it to the Strip, activate the Archimedes weapons system, or some other configuration, was one of the game's cleaner expressions of its recurring question about who gets what and who decides. Broad distribution was the most equitable option, and also the one that produced the least concentrated benefit to any one party, which meant it was the hardest to build political will around. Concentration to the Strip served House's interests. Archimedes served the courier's tactical interests at the expense of the facility's long-term usefulness. Each choice was internally coherent. Each had costs, and the costs were different depending on where you stood in the Mojave's social geography when the electricity did or did not arrive. The NCR soldiers stationed around Helios had been there long enough to develop the specific relationship to a posting that involves guarding something valuable without fully understanding what it does. They knew the plant was important. They knew that importance had strategic implications. They did not know the details, and the details were not the kind of thing that filtered down to perimeter guards in the normal operation of military information flow. They stood their posts in the desert heat and watched the mirrors track the sun, and did not know that the facility they were protecting had a weapon system concealed within it that could strike targets across the entire Mojave from orbit. The information asymmetry was not unusual. It was simply the ordinary condition of being a soldier. Camp Searchlight had been one of the NCR's most established forward positions in the Mojave, a functioning military installation with barracks and a fire station and a church and the accumulated infrastructure of a place that expected to be operating for years. The Legion had destroyed it, not through direct military assault, but through a single act of environmental sabotage. the introduction of radioactive material into the camp's supply chain in a way that contaminated the water and eventually the air of the entire location, rendering it uninhabitable for anyone without radiation protection equipment. The ghouls that wandered Searchlight streets when the courier arrived were the NCR soldiers who had been stationed there when the contamination occurred, transformed over time by the radiation they had absorbed rather than dying from it. They retained enough of their former identities to have become something specific. Not raider ghouls, not feral ghouls, but the remnants of military personnel in a destroyed military installation, organized by instinct and residual identity around the location that had been their posting. They moved through the ruins of the camp they had once maintained, and the ruins around them were the ruins of the military life that had ended their human lives while somehow continuing their existence. Corporal Betsy and the small team of NCR soldiers who had survived Searchlight by being away from the camp when the contamination occurred carried the specific guilt of people who had lived because they were elsewhere. They had gone on patrol, had carried out an assignment, had returned to find what had happened in their absence, and were now operating out of Camp Forlorn Hope with the knowledge that their absence from their home base had been the specific reason they were still alive. Survival and absence were connected for them in a way that could not be fully untangled, and the connection had consequences for how they related to both. The Legion's decision to use radiological contamination rather than direct assault at Searchlight revealed something about their strategic thinking that the NCR's conventional military planners had not fully anticipated. The Legion was willing to render territory permanently unusable if doing so served their purposes. They did not want Searchlight. They wanted the NCR not to have Searchlight. The distinction between taking something and destroying something, and the Legion's comfort with destruction as a primary strategic tool, was a recurring asymmetry in the campaign along the Mojave's eastern territories, the NCR built and held. The Legion destroyed and moved on. The resources required for each approach were very different, and the asymmetry favored the Legion in ways that no amount of NCR firepower could simply overcome. Jacobstown, in the mountains northwest of New Vegas, existed as a community of super mutants and nightkin who had chosen, through a specific combination of individual decision-making and the influence of Marcus, a super mutant of long experience and considerable wisdom, to live apart from the Mojave's main conflicts rather than within them. They had not been welcomed into the human communities of the wasteland and had not particularly sought to be. They had found a location that suited them, had established something that functioned as a community by whatever standards were available to them, and had been maintaining it with the particular stability that comes from having worked out most of the basic conflicts already. Marcus had been a central figure in Fallout 2's plot, had governed Broken Hills with a pragmatism that included genuine interspecies cooperation, and had eventually made his way to the Mojave with the specific quality of purpose that long-lived beings sometimes develop when they have outlasted everything they originally organized their lives around. He was not optimistic in any simple sense. He had seen too many good things fail to maintain the kind of optimism that requires successful outcomes. He was something more durable than optimistic. He was committed, which is what optimism becomes when it has survived sufficient disappointment to understand that disappointment is not a reason to stop. The Nightkin at Jacobstown presented a medical problem that Dr. Henry had been quietly working on for years. The Nightkin's extensive use of stealth boys, the pre-war personal cloaking devices that the Master's army had used as standard equipment, had produced across long-term use a specific form of psychological damage. The stealth boys had worked through a chemical process that involved stimulating the brain in ways that created reliable invisibility at the cost of a schizophrenic disorder. The Nightkin who came to Jacobstown were at various stages of this progression, from mildly affected to severely disassociated, and the community had organized itself partly around managing the range of states its members occupied at any given time. Lily Bowen, the Nightkin who could become the courier's companion, was a grandmother who had been taken by the Master's army when she was an elderly woman and subjected to the super mutant transformation process. which had preserved her physical capacity while leaving her with a fragmented relationship to her own continuity. She remembered her grandchildren. She talked about them with the specific specificity of someone who loves people very much, naming them, describing them, tracking their imagined ages across a timeline that the transformation process had disrupted. She had been separated from the people she loved by something that could not be undone, and she carried them in a memory that was itself unreliable, and she was still doing the best she could with what remained. The specific disturbing quality of Lily's situation was not her size or her combat capability, but the gap between the person she described being and the situation she found herself occupying. She had been ordinary. She had been a grandmother with grandchildren and a farm, and the particular dense texture of a life organized around relationships and daily responsibility. All of that had been interrupted, not ended, but suspended in the middle of it. And she was still carrying the interrupted life around with her in a body that was not the one she had been carrying it in before, in a world that had no mechanism for returning her to what she had been. The Brotherhood of Steel's Mojave chapter operated from Hidden Valley, concealed beneath the desert floor in a bunker complex that the organization's characteristic culture of secrecy had rendered nearly invisible to the surrounding wasteland's knowledge. They had been in the Mojave for long enough to have developed a complicated history with the NCR, a history that included a military engagement at Helios 1 that had cost the Brotherhood a significant portion of their operational capacity and had never been fully recovered from. The bunker at Hidden Valley was not a forward operating position, it was a retreat, and the Brotherhood inside it knew it. Elder McNamara governed the chapter through a policy of near-total lockdown that had been in place since the Helios defeat. No one went out, no one came in. The Brotherhood's traditional posture of technological acquisitiveness, the belief that pre-war technology needed to be collected and protected by those capable of using it, had been replaced by a survival posture organized around not drawing attention. This was not McNamara's preferred position. It was the position that the chapter's situation had forced on him, and he maintained it with the particular unhappiness of someone who is doing the right thing in circumstances they did not choose and would not have chosen. The internal conflict within Hidden Valley between McNamara and Paladin Hardin represented a disagreement about what the Brotherhood's continued existence was for. McNamara believed the chapter needed to survive above all else, that a brotherhood that survived a difficult period was worth more than one that made bold moves and was destroyed for them. Hardin believed that a brotherhood that had abandoned its foundational purpose in order to survive had already lost the thing that made survival worthwhile, that the lockdown was not preservation, but slow dissolution dressed in the language of caution. Both positions were internally consistent. The chapter was small enough that the difference between them was existential. The knights and paladins who lived inside the Hidden Valley bunker had been in a peculiar form of suspended animation, not literally, but functionally. They had the training and the equipment and the tradition of a military organization, and they had nowhere to deploy it. The drills continued. The maintenance schedules were followed. The hierarchy was observed, but the purpose that should have been directing those activities was present only as aspiration, as memory, as the residue of what the Brotherhood had been before the NCR's campaign had reduced this chapter to a bunker in a desert with no clear future. The organization's discipline was being applied to the problem of its own survival, which is not what discipline is usually for. Veronica Santangelo, who could become the courier's companion after meeting her at the 188 trading post, was a Brotherhood scribe whose relationship to the organization was exactly the kind of complicated that long membership in an institution you have genuine doubts about tends to produce. She believed in certain of the Brotherhood's values, was uncertain about others, and was most uncertain about the specific ways the Brotherhood's institutional culture had organized itself around those values in ways that excluded possibilities she cared about. She had asked questions that the Brotherhood's internal culture did not have good mechanisms for processing. She had received answers she found insufficient. She was still there, still affiliated, still doing the work, but the affiliation sat differently on her than it sat on colleagues who had not asked the same questions. The satellite dishes of the Big MT cast shadows across a facility that had been, before the war, the most advanced research complex in the Americas. Its funding had come from sources that included the military, the civilian government, and private corporations whose interest in the research had ranged from the genuine to the extractive. The researchers who had worked there had been given access to resources that no university could have provided, had been asked to push at the boundaries of what was technically possible with the support of institutions that understood the value of pushing those boundaries, and had produced results that the pre war world had not had time to fully integrate before the bombs ended the immediate context. The facility's surviving AI systems, beyond the think tank and the sink, included infrastructure intelligences that had been running continuous operations for 2 centuries without any human oversight that might have questioned whether those operations were still serving any useful purpose. The maintenance systems continued to maintain. The experimental protocols continued to run. The data collection continued to collect data that was transmitted to no one and analyzed by no one, and would eventually fill storage systems to capacity without ever being read. The facility was, in the most complete sense, available, a machine that had been left running because no one had turned it off. The Old World Blues expansion's humor was built on the gap between the think tank scientists' genuine brilliance and their institutional amnesia. The way that very smart people, separated from social context and ethical accountability, had continued doing work that was technically impressive and practically insane. They had removed their own brains from their skulls and placed them in life support containers, extending their functional existence by removing themselves from the biological vulnerability that most beings share. The procedure had worked. It had also removed them from the embodied experience of having a body, which turned out to have significant effects on how they processed ethical questions that their bodies would have answered before their minds got involved. The courier's own brain, heart, and spine had been removed during the course of arriving at the facility and placed in similar life support. The procedure having been performed by the think tank, with the particular careless enthusiasm of researchers who saw an interesting experimental subject and proceeded without fully explaining what they were doing. The courier functioned without these organs through mechanisms the game acknowledged as mysterious, without fully explaining, which was consistent with the rest of the courier's somewhat miraculous survival history, but was also, when explicitly foregrounded by the situation, somewhat disturbing in the way that things which should be impossible tend to be disturbing when they are happening to you directly. The Cazador research that Dr. Boris had conducted represented the think tank's approach to biology applied to a specific application, the creation of something that was dangerous enough to be weaponized. The Cazadors that plagued the Mojave outside the Big MT's dome were the product of that research. Escaped experimental specimens that had established breeding populations in the surrounding territory and had been doing so for long enough to be a serious hazard throughout the region. Boris had created something genuinely terrible and had then experienced the consequences of its release as primarily a data collection opportunity. The Cazadors were an external contamination generated by internal research, a pattern that repeated itself across the facility's history in different forms. The ghost people of the Sierra Madre had originated from Big MT research as well, test subjects for protective suits that had been designed to allow humans to operate in contaminated environments. Suits that had ultimately bonded to the wearers in ways that could not be reversed and that had changed the wearers in ways that extended beyond the physical. The suits were still working. They continued to protect their wearers from the cloud even after everything else had changed. The protection was genuine. It was also total enclosure, permanent, inescapable, the original purpose of the technology surviving the humanity of the people it had been applied to. The ghost people were what happened when a protective technology worked too well and had no off switch. The mutated insects and creatures of the Mojave had been the wasteland's ecosystem for long enough to have developed the specific equilibrium of a food web that had reorganized itself around radiation tolerance and the absence of many pre-war species. The cazadores occupied a position in that food web that they had carved out through a combination of exceptional aggression, extreme venom toxicity, and a reproductive rate that compensated for individual fragility by producing enough offspring to sustain population pressure regardless of losses. They were successful by the standards the wasteland applied to success, which were survival based rather than aesthetic. The venom that cazadores produced had a paralytic quality that distinguished it from simple pain response. It shut down motor function progressively, leaving the affected creature conscious but physically unable to respond while the cazadores continued their attack. This was not a feature that had been engineered into the pre-war cazador research, or if it had been engineered, the engineering had refined during 2 centuries of natural selection for effectiveness. The cazadores that a Mojave traveler encountered were the descendants of the most effective cazadores, selected by a process that rewarded exactly the qualities that made them so difficult to survive encountering. The Brahmin herders and caravan operators who moved through cazador territory had developed practical knowledge about cazador behavior, movement patterns, nesting locations that made encounters more or less likely. They constituted a form of expertise the Mojave's more institutionalized organizations did not always recognize as expertise because it was not written down and was not produced by formal research. The herder who knew where not to take the herd in Cazador's season had knowledge that was as functionally important as anything in an NCR tactical manual, and the knowledge had been built up through the same mechanism that most practical knowledge is built up, which is iterative experience with consequences severe enough to ensure careful attention. The deathclaw population of the Mojave had established itself across the region's landscape in patterns that reflected deathclaw behavior developed over generations in the specific conditions of the post-nuclear Mojave. They nested in locations that combined shelter, defensibility, and proximity to prey populations, and they defended those locations with the systematic thoroughness that apex predators display when they have no significant competition for the territory they occupy. Dead Wind Cavern, in the southern Mojave, was one of the largest and most established deathclaw nesting sites in the region, maintained by a population that had been building its presence there long enough to have developed something approaching territorial custom. The Deathclaw matriarch at Deadwind Cavern was among the largest and most dangerous creatures available in the game's environment, a distinction that carried practical implications for anyone who encountered her, and somewhat abstract implications for anyone who considered what it meant that such a creature existed and had been building a family in a specific location for what appeared to be years. She was protecting something. The protection was directed toward eggs, toward young, toward the continuation of a population that had no conception of itself as a population and was simply doing what the organisms in it were organized to do. The scale of her dangerousness was proportionate to the scale of what she was protecting, which is a principle that applies broadly but registers differently when the applying organism weighs as much as a small vehicle. The pre-war Deathclaw project, military research into genetically modified Jackson's chameleons, the original organism that had been selected and then iteratively modified for the military applications that the project's designers had in mind, had produced something that outlasted everything the project's designers had intended to accomplish with it. The military context that had generated the research was gone. The strategic purposes the Deathclaw had been meant to serve were historical footnotes and terminals that nobody read. What remained was the organism, continuing to do what organisms do regardless of the purposes that produced them, occupying its ecological niche with the competence of something that had been designed to be very good at surviving, and had then had 2 centuries to practice. The specific mechanics of what the Legion arranged at Nipton Reward Examination beyond the initial impact of arriving and finding what had been left there. The lottery format was not accidental. It was chosen because a lottery is a system that everyone in a population participates in simultaneously, that produces outcomes distributed across the full range available: death, enslavement, suffering, and the single exception of freedom, and that does so through a process experienced as arbitrary rather than as judgment. A direct execution communicates that specific people were targeted for specific reasons. A lottery communicates that everyone was equally subject to the Legion's power, that survival was a matter of the Legion's discretion rather than any quality of the individual survivor. The single winner of the lottery, the man who walked away with the specific label of being the one who had been allowed to go free, carried the psychological burden of that designation in a way that the Legion had anticipated and designed. He had survived by luck. He had survived while others had not. He was being sent back into the world as a living message. And the message was not simply that the Legion was dangerous. That could have been communicated more directly. The message was about the quality of the Legion's power, about its ability to produce arbitrary outcomes and then release one person to describe those outcomes in their own words to everyone they encountered afterward. The testimony of a survivor who cannot explain why they survived is a more effective form of terror communication than any explicit threat, because it leaves the listener without the possibility of reasoning their way into safety. Volp's incultus patience in waiting for the courier to arrive at Nipton, his willingness to explain what had happened in clear and articulate terms, his evident absence of guilt or defensiveness about what he had organized. These were the behaviors of someone who had completely internalized the framework within which the lottery made sense, who had no internal perspective from which to evaluate it that was not also a Legion perspective. He was not pretending not to feel what he would otherwise feel. He genuinely occupied a position from which the Nipton lottery was a professional accomplishment, a competently executed operation, an example of the Legion's methods working as designed. The absence of internal conflict in him was not a performance. It was the genuine product of the Legion's formative process applied successfully to a specific person. The dam itself, the physical structure, the pre-war engineering, the concrete and steel organized across the Colorado River, was built in a period when large infrastructure projects were understood as statements about what human beings could accomplish when they organized collective effort around ambitious goals. It had been built by thousands of workers over years, had been, at the time of its construction, one of the largest concrete structures in the world, had generated power for decades before the bombs, and had continued to generate power in the centuries after, because the river kept moving and the turbines kept spinning, and the fundamental physics of the arrangement were not affected by what had happened to the human civilization that had built it. What made Hoover Dam worth fighting over in the Mojave's political context was the concentration of resources it represented, the electricity it generated, the water it controlled, the symbolic weight it carried as the most significant piece of pre-war infrastructure still functioning in the region. Each of these elements was independently valuable, and their combination created a strategic prize that justified the cost of contesting it. The NCR's presence in the Mojave was organized substantially around holding the dam. The Legion's campaign in the Mojave was organized substantially around taking it. House's entire long-range planning assumed control of the dam as a foundational requirement. The physical structure was the same in all of these plans. The meaning assigned to it differed with the political framework of whoever was doing the assigning. The workers who had maintained the dam in the years between the war and the current conflicts had been the followers of the apocalypse, who had understood the dam's value in terms of its practical output, and had provided technical maintenance without the military protection that would have been necessary to hold it against a serious assault. When the NCR arrived, the followers had negotiated a continued presence that allowed them to keep doing the work while the NCR provided security, and the arrangement had been functional until it became politically complicated. And then it had continued being complicated in the way that arrangements between idealistic service organizations and military governments typically are. The Battle of Hoover Dam, whichever form it took under the courier's choices, was the moment when all of the Mojave's accumulated political tensions resolved into direct physical confrontation. Everything that had been building across the region's landscape, the NCR's overextension, the Legion's patience, House's calculation, the independent community's precarious equilibrium, came together at a specific location on a specific day. And the outcome was determined by factors that included the courier's choices and the forces those choices had assembled or failed to assemble. The dam existed before all of this and continued to exist after it, still generating power, still holding back the river, still being the physical thing it had always been, regardless of who the day's fighting had decided controlled it. The commercial caravans that connected the Mojave's various communities were among the most genuinely important institutions in the region, performing the function of distributing goods across distances that would have been impassable for individuals carrying their own supplies. The caravan operators, the Crimson Caravan Company, the Fargo Traders, the Gunrunners Distribution Network, each had different operational models and different relationships to the various factions whose territories they moved through. And those relationships required constant maintenance because the territory's political situation was not stable enough to make any arrangement permanent. Alice McLafferty, who managed the Crimson Caravan's New Vegas operations, was one of the game's more quietly unsettling figures, precisely because her methods were entirely recognizable. She was a good business person, in the sense that the term has always meant skilled at identifying advantages, willing to use competitive pressure to eliminate obstacles, organized around her company's interests with a consistency that excluded considerations that did not serve those interests. The specific practices she used to maintain the Crimson Caravan's market position were practices that would have been familiar in any pre-war commercial context, which was precisely what made them disturbing in a post-nuclear world, where the thin margin between survival and starvation made commercial pressure something closer to violence than it was in the world that produced those practices. The individual caravan guards who accompanied shipments across the Mojave's road network occupied a position in the economy that was as exposed as any position available. They moved through territory that was contested by death claws, legion raiders, powder gangers, and random opportunists, doing so on behalf of companies whose response to losing a guard was to replace them from the pool of available applicants. The wages were not high, the benefits were non-existent, the risk was extreme, and the job existed because the alternative, no commercial distribution, was worse for the region than paying the human cost of maintaining it. The guards understood this calculation. Most of them were not guarding caravans because they had evaluated it as optimal. They were guarding caravans because it was available and they needed to eat. Samuel Kerr at the Mojave outpost represented the civilian population that depended on caravan access in the most direct possible way. The road was blocked. The caravans were not moving. The supplies that the caravan network normally delivered to communities along the Southern Highway were not arriving. This was not an abstraction for communities that depended on those supplies. It was a material problem with material consequences that expressed themselves in the specific forms that shortage takes: reduced food availability, medical supply depletion, the kind of economic pressure that produces secondary effects in communities already operating without reserves. The death claws at Quarry Junction were a wildlife management problem that translated directly into a humanitarian situation, and the translation was immediate and ongoing. The NCR Rangers, who operated throughout the Mojave, had a history that predated the organization's formal military structure, emerging from the frontier law enforcement tradition that the pre-war California Republic had developed for policing territories at the edge of settled authority. They had been, in various periods of the Republic's history, everything from bounty hunters to wilderness survival specialists to something close to special operations forces, and the accumulation of those different historical functions had produced a culture that valued self-sufficiency, field judgment, and the specific kind of competence that comes from operating without close institutional oversight. Ghost, stationed at Camp Golf as a scout and intelligence operative, represented the ranger's tradition at its most self sufficient. She had been in the Mojave long enough to have developed a relationship to its landscape that went beyond tactical familiarity into something that resembled the kind of knowledge that the Mojave's native human populations had once maintained. The knowledge of where things were, how they moved, what the terrain looked like in conditions that required moving through it at night, or in ways that avoided contact. She operated with a minimal footprint and maintained awareness of the region's political movements with a comprehensiveness that the NCR's conventional intelligence apparatus could not match at her operational scale. The veteran rangers, whose distinctive black armor was an indicator of experience accumulated across years of Mojave service, were not common because the process of becoming one required surviving long enough to warrant the equipment and performing well enough to receive it. They were genuine specialists in the way that the Rangers' historical culture had always aspired to produce, and their presence in the Mojave's various contested zones had a quality that even the Legion's best soldiers responded to with caution. They were among the few human elements in the Mojave that could be reliably described as more dangerous than the environment they operated in, which was not a low standard. The relationship between the Rangers and the conventional NCR military was one of those internal tensions that large organizations typically manage by allowing the specialized unit to operate with significant autonomy while maintaining nominal integration into the broader command structure. Oliver's authority over Ranger operations was real in principle and limited in practice, and the Rangers operated under the understanding that their effectiveness depended on a degree of independence that bureaucratic oversight would compromise. This was not unique to the NCR or to the Mojave. It was the standard arrangement between organizations that needed unconventional capability and the conventional hierarchies that were uncomfortable with the conditions that unconventional capability required. The new California Republic Correctional Facility had been, before the prisoner uprising that converted it into the Powder Gangers' base of operations, a functioning prison. One of the NCR's attempts to extend its institutional infrastructure into the Mojave, to bring the mechanisms of civil law and civil punishment to a region where those mechanisms had previously not existed. The prisoners who worked in the explosive ordnance labor details had access to materials that, in combination with the knowledge that prisoners accumulate from each other in the specific educational environment that incarceration provides, allowed for an uprising that the facility's guards were not resourced to contain. The Powder Gangers who spread across the southern Mojave after the facility's fall were not a coherent organization with a program. They were a collection of former prisoners sharing a tactical circumstance, access to explosives, familiarity with each other, and a mutual interest in remaining free, who had organized themselves loosely around that circumstance without developing anything resembling the political or social infrastructure that would allow them to become something more durable. They were dangerous in the specific way that armed people without governance structures are dangerous, which is somewhat unpredictably and primarily in relation to things they wanted or feared in their immediate vicinity. Eddie, who led the faction from the correctional facility, had organizational capability that the situation was too chaotic to fully leverage. He could direct the powder gangers who remained in and around the facility with reasonable effectiveness, but the powder gangers who had dispersed into the wasteland were beyond meaningful coordination. They had taken what the uprising made available and were using it for individual survival purposes, which was rational from their perspective and was producing the kind of persistent regional insecurity that would eventually attract enough NCR attention to result in a comprehensive response. Eddie understood this and could not solve it because solving it would have required the kind of institutional capacity that the uprising had specifically demonstrated the facility lacked. The civilian population's experience of the powder gangers, Good Springs residents worried about Cobb's demands, travelers avoiding the highway sections where attacks were most frequent, settlers making calculations about which routes were worth the risk, was the ground-level reality of what the loss of regional security felt like as a lived experience. Security is one of those things that is most noticeable when it is absent and its absence had a texture in the Mojave that the courier moved through and could address in specific locations, but could not comprehensively resolve because the conditions producing insecurity were larger than any single intervention. The followers of the apocalypse maintained field operations throughout the Mojave that were distinct from their fixed installations. Individuals and small teams who moved through the region providing medical care, collecting information, building relationships with communities that had not otherwise been in contact with the organization's services. These field operations were the followers' most direct expression of their founding principles, the most immediate implementation of the belief that knowledge and care should reach people where they were, rather than requiring people to travel to where the knowledge and care were concentrated. Dr. Usanagi at the New Vegas Medical Clinic provided a service that operated at the interface between the followers' ideals and the economic realities of the Strip's context. She charged for her services. The charges were, by her own assessment, reasonable given the costs of maintaining the clinic and the supplies required. They were also beyond the reach of most Freeside residents, which meant the clinic served primarily those with NCR pay vouchers or strip access, the people who were already relatively protected. This was not what the followers' principles called for. It was what the economics of operating near the strip produced, and Dr. Usanagi navigated the tension between those two things with pragmatic competence and evident discomfort. The field followers, who moved through more remote areas of the Mojave, operated under conditions that the organization's New Vegas presence somewhat obscured. Access to medicine was not a given in the wasteland's more distant communities, and the follower who arrived at a settlement with medical supplies and the knowledge to use them was providing something that might be the difference between a community remaining viable and a community losing members to treatable conditions. The work was unglamorous and physically demanding, and compensated primarily by the knowledge that it was necessary, which was sufficient for some people and insufficient for others, and the followers drew their field personnel from the former category. The boomers, living in and around Nellis Air Force Base, north of New Vegas, had been isolated from the surrounding wasteland for generations by an active policy of hostility that they enforced with pre-war artillery equipment of sufficient caliber to make approaching the base grounds genuinely life-threatening. They had come from a vault whose specific conditions had produced a cultural orientation around self-sufficiency and protection that expressed itself, once outside the vault, in the decision to find a location that could be defended, fill it with the most capable weapons available, and make it absolutely clear that visitors were not welcome. The result, after generations, was a community that had preserved extraordinary technical knowledge, the knowledge required to maintain and operate pre-war aircraft, the knowledge required to maintain artillery, the knowledge required to sustain a community with minimal external support, and had also preserved a social insularity that left them largely unaware of how the Mojave's larger political situation had developed around them. They knew about the NCR and the Legion in abstract terms, as threats that had not yet found the path across their defensive perimeter. They did not know the details of the dam conflict or the alignments available in it, because knowing the details would have required engagement with the outside world that their culture had organized itself against. Pearl led the boomers with the authority of someone who had been alive long enough to remember a time when the base's isolation had been a choice actively made rather than a condition inherited. Her age gave her a specific weight in the community's decision-making, and her weight was conservative, oriented toward maintaining what the boomers had rather than extending toward what they might become. She was not incurious, but she was careful, and the two traits combined into a governance style that had preserved the community's functional capability across difficult conditions by resisting the kind of expansion that would have made them visible and therefore vulnerable. The B-29 bomber in Lake Mead's depths, recoverable through the effort of the courier's assistance, was the specific prize that made the boomers worth engaging with for various factions interested in the dam battle. A functioning World War II-era aircraft restored to operational capacity by people who had been maintaining aviation knowledge for generations in the absence of anywhere to fly. The combination was exactly the kind of historical artifact that the Mojave preserved not through institutional decision, but through the specific coincidence of a community organized around a particular technological tradition being located near a particular body of water where a particular plane had gone down. Regis understood the Legion in the way that people who have studied an organization's behavior across multiple interactions understand it, not from the inside, not through access to its internal communications, but from the outside record of what it had done to every tribal group it had encountered over the years of its expansion. He had looked at that record with the specific attention of someone whose community was being offered an alliance with the organization the record described. And what the record showed was consistent enough to constitute a clear pattern. The pattern was that the Legion did not maintain tribal identities after absorption. The names survived sometimes in modified form as Legion unit designations. The people survived, often as soldiers or workers. What did not survive was the culture, the set of practices and stories and relationships that constituted a tribal people as a people rather than as a collection of individuals. The Khans, if they accepted Caesar's alliance and followed through on the cooperative role they had been offered in the Dam battle, would cease to exist as the Khans within a generation. They would become something the Legion had a name for, and the Khan's own name would be the Legion's to use or discard as operational requirements dictated. Papa Khan could not hear this clearly because the Khan's identity was already in a diminished state, and diminished identities are particularly vulnerable to the appeal of frameworks that offer expansion and significance. Caesar was offering the Khans recognition, was treating them as a force worth incorporating rather than as a problem to be managed. And that recognition felt different from what the NCR had been offering, which was management at best and elimination at worst. The emotional resonance of being seen was difficult to weigh against the analytical case that being seen by Caesar was itself a kind of danger, and Regis knew this and could not fix it, only name it and hope the naming was enough. The daughter of Regis's concern, the young Khan woman whose wasteland name was Jack, and who ran the Khan's drug operation with an efficiency that belied her circumstances, represented the generation that would live with whatever choice Papa Khan made. She had no particular investment in the NCR, no particular fear of the Legion that had not yet directly reached the Khans, and no particular patience with either. She had an operation to run, a product to move, a community's economic survival to maintain, and the larger political question was only relevant to her insofar as it affected those practical concerns. The Khan's younger members were not ideologically committed. They were practically oriented toward survival, and survival's requirements were immediate. The Tops, the Gomorrah, and the Ultra Lux each occupied a distinct position in the strip's social ecosystem, each attracting a different segment of the visitors who came from across the Mojave and beyond to spend NCR currency or trade goods in the manufactured environments their respective families had constructed. The distinctions between them were not accidental. House had allocated territory and approved operational models based on a calculation about what combination of experiences would maximize the strip's overall attractiveness to the widest possible range of potential visitors. And the three casinos' different personalities were as much a product of design as of the individual inclinations of the families who ran them. The Tops catered to the aesthetic that Benny and the chairman had developed around the pre-war lounge culture that their research into old holotapes and recordings had reconstructed, if imperfectly, with the specific creative distortions that result from building something from incomplete reference material. The music was there, the style was there, the presentation was there, and the commitment with which the chairman inhabited the aesthetic was genuine enough that the reconstruction had developed its own authenticity over years of practice. Guests at the Tops were being offered an experience of a past that had never quite existed in the form presented, but had been assembled from enough real components that the experience had a quality of the authentic that complete invention would not have achieved. Gomorrah operated in the space that the Strip's more respectable casinos declined to occupy directly. providing services that required the kind of infrastructure a dedicated establishment could provide, and that the NCR's soldiers and traders and occasional civilian visitors came to the Mojave seeking in sufficient numbers to constitute a viable market. The Omertas maintained the surface of their arrangement with House while managing the underneath with the specific contempt of people who had made an agreement they intended to honor only insofar as it could not be avoided. The services Gomorrah provided were real services. The contempt for the customers was also real, managed through professionalism into invisibility, but present in the institutional culture in ways that shaped decisions at every level of the operation. The White Glove Society at the Ultralux had constructed around themselves an atmosphere of pre-war aristocratic refinement that the other casinos did not attempt to match. Their guests were expected to dress well, to maintain a standard of social behavior calibrated to an imagined pre-war elegance, to participate in the performance of a civilization that the bombs had interrupted. The kitchen at the Ultralux produced meals that were the finest available on the Strip. The sourcing of those meals was a disturbing detail concealed beneath the dining room's considerable surface elegance, a detail that the courier could either uncover and act upon or move through without ever knowing, and that sat differently in retrospect once known, casting a particular light backward onto the experience of being welcomed graciously by staff who were very carefully not discussing certain things. The Rad Scorpions of the Mojave represented one of the more successful mutational trajectories in the wasteland's post-nuclear ecological shift. Pre-war scorpions, already extremely well adapted to desert conditions, had absorbed sufficient radiation to scale dramatically. The bark scorpions that had been common across the Mojave's pre-war landscape had produced descendant populations ranging from merely alarming to genuinely catastrophic in scale, with the largest individuals representing prey animals capable of challenging death claws for territorial dominance in specific terrain types. The venom had scaled with the body in ways that the original organism's chemistry suggested, but that the magnitude of the change still managed to surpass. The bark scorpion nests that appeared throughout the Mojave's ruins and natural spaces were understood by experienced travelers as indicators of territory to navigate around rather than through whenever possible. A piece of practical route knowledge that translated directly into survival statistics for people who paid attention to it versus people who did not. The nests were not randomly placed. The scorpions had preferences that reflected pre-war scorpion habitat requirements, modified by the post-nuclear environment-specific features. Understanding those preferences, knowing where the nests were most likely to appear and in what density, was the kind of ecological knowledge that veteran Mojave travelers accumulated and shared with the same seriousness that military organizations share intelligence about enemy emplacements. The giant red scorpion, at the upper end of the size range available in the game's encounters, had achieved a scale at which it was capable of things that ordinary predators were not. It could excavate. It could maintain burrow systems large enough to be effectively invisible on surface inspection. It could sustain itself on prey populations that would have been beyond the reach of smaller competitors. It occupied, in the Mojave's revised food web, a position that had no exact pre-war equivalent, too large to be managed by ordinary human defensive measures, too territorial to be avoided through simple route adjustment in areas where its territory was extensive. The people who lived in those areas had developed relationships to rad scorpion presence that ranged from careful coexistence to active hunting to simple relocation, depending on what resources they had available. There is a note in a ruined house north of Boulder City, left beside a pre-war family photograph, that describes in 6 sentences the process by which a family of 4 had made their final decisions. The person who wrote it had specific handwriting, specific choices of word, specific concerns about specific people. They had expected someone to read it. No one who knew any of the people in the photograph had read it for 200 years. And then a courier with no connection to any of them read it in passing through a ruin on the way to somewhere else. And for a moment, the specific texture of that family's final hours was available to someone, and then it was not available to anyone specific anymore, filed in a memory alongside hundreds of similar notes in a landscape full of them. The game does not draw attention to most of these notes. They sit in the environment at the same level of presence as the objects beside them: the photograph, the broken furniture, the scattered plates that had once held food. They are findable for players who look in the places where notes tend to be left, and they describe situations that are not connected to any quest, are not required reading for understanding any plot, and are present simply because the designers understood that a world in which people had lived and died would be full of the records that people leave when they expect they may not be able to speak for themselves going forward. The cumulative effect of reading enough of these notes is not grief, exactly, though it contains elements of grief. It is more like the specific form of understanding that comes from holding many individual losses at once, from recognizing, in each particular note, the general pattern of what happened when the bombs fell and people made the decisions that the next few hours required. The notes are not summarizable because summaries lose the specific texture of each one. They are simply present in the ruins, distributed across the game's geography, waiting for whoever arrives with enough attention to pick them up and read what was left. Water in the Mojave was not simply a physical resource. It was a political fact, an economic instrument, an index of power in a landscape where survival without adequate water was not a question of discomfort, but of biological timeline. The communities that controlled water sources controlled the surrounding territory's population movements, because people went where water was and avoided where water was not, regardless of other considerations. The organizations that could reliably supply water to populations that could not reliably supply it themselves had leverage that translated directly into political influence. The NCR's interest in Hoover Dam was partly electrical and substantially hydraulic. The dam controlled the Colorado River's flow through the region, and control of the flow meant control of who had access to reliable irrigation, who had access to the water table that the river's movement maintained, who could grow food in quantities that exceeded subsistence, and therefore who could support the kind of settled population concentration that civilization requires. The dam was not just a power plant. It was a water management system for an entire region, and the political implications of controlling it were proportionate to the scale of what it managed. New Vegas's water supply, managed through systems that House had maintained and improved during his 2 centuries of oversight, was one of the specific things that made the Strip possible as a functioning commercial center. Without reliable water delivery, the casinos could not operate. Without the casinos, the economic activity that sustained the Strip's value to House could not occur. Without that economic activity, the Strip's political weight in the Mojave's power calculations collapsed to zero. Water was at the base of the entire arrangement, as it was at the base of all of the Mojave's viable settlements, and its management was therefore at the base of all viable political power. The independent water merchants, who operated throughout the region's smaller settlements, were performing a function that no large organization had organized itself to provide at that scale. Moving water in containers along routes that were not served by any formal distribution system, charging prices that reflected the risk and cost of the service. They were essential in the literal sense of providing something without which the communities they served could not sustain themselves, and they operated without recognition, without institutional support, and with the specific vulnerability of small operators in a region where larger forces were always potentially interested in the resources they managed. There is a perk in Fallout New Vegas called Cannibal. It allows the player character to feed on human corpses to restore health. The perk exists because the design team decided that the wasteland should accommodate as a viable survival strategy, a behavior that most human ethical systems have placed in a special category of violation, not because it is uniquely harmful to the person being consumed, who is already dead, but because of what the practice signals about the consumer's relationship to human personhood and dignity. The perk is not presented with horror or moral commentary. It is presented in the format of every other perk: a description, a mechanical benefit, a decision point available to the player. The decision to take it or not take it is the players, and the game's response to the decision is primarily mechanical. Certain companions respond negatively if they observe the behavior. Certain NPCs can detect it. The social consequences are real within the fiction, and they reflect the social norms of the wasteland, not the player's own moral context. What the cannibal perk illustrates about the game's design philosophy is the consistency with which Fallout New Vegas refused to build explicit moral guardrails into its design. The choice is available. The consequences are rendered. The judgment is left to the player. This approach was not unique to the cannibal perk. It was the approach the game took toward nearly everything, from faction alignments to companion treatment to quest resolutions. The world would respond to what you did. The world would not tell you how to feel about what you did. That was considered your own work to do, and the game trusted that you would do it. The trust was itself a kind of respect, if an unusual kind. The respect of being given the full range of choices available without having the worst ones removed from consideration on your behalf. In a landscape organized around the question of who gets to decide, and what they decide, and what follows from their decisions, the decision to leave the hardest choices available was itself a decision about what kind of story the wasteland was. It was not a story about people who could only make good choices. It was a story about people who could make all the choices and lived in the consequences of them. The courier is, in almost every meaningful sense, the most unusual person in the Mojave. Not because of extraordinary physical capability, though that develops across the course of the game. Not because of unique access to information, though that accumulates, but because the courier moves through the Mojave's various political territories as someone who has no fixed affiliation with any of them, who has relationships with all of them, who has been shaped by the specific experiences of the journey, but has not been produced by any of the ideological formation processes that shaped Caesar's legionaries, or House's Securitron technicians, or the NCR's troopers. This non-affiliation was not the neutral position it might appear. Every choice the courier made was still a choice with political consequences. Every conversation, every alliance offered or refused, every faction assisted or allowed to be harmed, these were political acts that accumulated into a record that the Mojave read and responded to. The courier's non-affiliation was not immunity to the landscape's politics. It was a specific kind of vulnerability to all of them simultaneously, combined with a specific kind of freedom from any single framework's demands. The courier's amnesia, the specific memory loss produced by being shot in the head and then medically recovered, was part of the game's larger project of making the player's own choices the primary constitutive element of who the courier was. Without a detailed established backstory filling the psychological space, the courier's identity had to be built forward from the moment of waking in Doc Mitchell's house, and the building was done through the choices the game provided. What the courier cared about, what they were willing to do and not do, what they valued about the various factions and people they encountered. All of this was available to be decided by the person playing rather than by narrative fiat. The disturbing implication of this design was that the courier's moral character was precisely as good or as terrible as the choices the player made, and the game was built with enough range that both extremes were available. A courier who helped every community they passed through, who protected the vulnerable, who made choices based on the interests of the people most affected rather than the interests of the powerful who could reward the choice. That courier was available. So was a courier who helped the Legion grind the Mojave's independent communities into submission, who killed innocents for resources, who treated the people of the wasteland as obstacles or tools. The range was intentional. The range was the point. The disturbing quality of having full range available, of being trusted with it, was part of what made the game persist in memory as something more than entertainment. The desert beyond the dam's glow has grown very quiet now, and the stories that live in its dust are settling back into the silence from which they came. All those voices, Caesar's cold certainty, House's distant calculation, the followers' tired idealism, Joshua Graham's bandaged conviction, the people of Freeside watching the strip's lights from a distance that never quite shortened. They have said what they had to say and now rest. As the night deepens and the stars over the Mojave do what stars over wastelands have always done, which is to continue regardless. The Mojave's secrets are patient things. They waited 200 years to be found by whoever was walking through the ruins with enough attention to notice them, and they will wait again, and there is a strange comfort in that patience. In the knowledge that the stories do not need to be fully understood to be real, do not need a listener to remain true. They rest in the landscape like bones in sand, present whether anyone finds them or not, disturbing in precisely the degree that honest things are disturbing, which is to say, considerably and gently, and in ways that do not resolve. There is another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play softly beside you. You may drift into sleep while something new unfolds. Thanks for watching. If you felt calm wandering through these soft moments, there's another video on the left of your screen. Maybe let it play as you settle in. It might guide you into an even deeper rest.